Her hands tremble as she serves coffee to the strangers in her modest roadside inn. Every local in Pinewood Valley knows to treat Margaret Sullivan with gentle kindness, a widow whose grief seems etched into her frail frame. The tremors started after she buried her husband 3 years ago. But what these bandits don't realize is that behind those shaking hands and downcast eyes lies a past shrouded in classified missions and government secrets. Before she was Margaret Sullivan, grieving widow and innkeeper, she was Agent Margaret Steady Hand Reynolds, the CIA's most accomplished sniper, with confirmed eliminations across 4 continents. Now, as the Blackwell gang terrorizes this peaceful mountain town, they've made one fatal miscalculation. They've mistaken her trembling hands for weakness, never suspecting that those same shaking fingers become preternaturally still the moment she wraps them around the grip of a rifle. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountain mist clung to the valley floor like a ghostly blanket as morning broke over Pinewood Valley. The first rays of sunlight pierced through the ancient pines, casting long shadows across the gravel road that wound its way through the heart of this remote Colorado community. Nestled against the foothills of the Rockies, Pinewood was the kind of place most travelers passed through without a second glance. One main street, a handful of family-owned businesses, and a sense of timelessness that seemed to exist nowhere else in America anymore. At the edge of town, just where the forest began to thicken, stood Sullivan's Rest, a 2-story wooden inn that had weathered nearly 8 decades of mountain winters. Its weatherboard exterior had been painted a soft blue years ago, now faded to a gentle grey that seemed to blend with the morning fog. A hand-carved sign swung gently in the mountain breeze, the words "Sullivan's Rest" etched alongside a simple pine tree. Inside, Margaret Sullivan moved with methodical precision through her morning routine. At 52, her once auburn hair had silvered at the temples, pulled back in a simple bun that emphasized the sharp angles of her face. She was lean and tall, though something in her posture, a slight forward curve of the shoulders, a careful way of holding herself, gave visitors the impression of fragility. The tremor in her hands was most noticeable as she measured coffee, grounds into the industrial percolator, the small metal scoop rattling against the glass. It was always worse in the mornings, before she'd had her own cup of coffee, before the day's routines could settle her nerves. At least that's what she told the concerned locals who often offered to help. "Just the cold mountain air getting into these old bones," she would say with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. The truth, like most things about Margaret Sullivan, was considerably more complicated. The inn's dining room was empty this is early, chairs still upturned on the tables from last night's cleaning. Margaret paused at the large picture window, looking out toward the road as she sipped her first coffee of the day. Her eyes, a startling shade of amber that could appear almost golden in certain light, scanned the tree line with an awareness that seemed at odds with her supposedly simple life. 3 years she'd been in Pinewood Valley. 3 years of carefully constructed routine. 3 years of being exactly what everyone expected, a widow finding solace in quiet work, in serving others, in the predictable rhythms of running a small-town establishment. 3 years of safety. The sound of tires on gravel broke her reverie. A black SUV with tinted windows pulled into the inn's small parking area, far too early for the usual check-in time. It was followed by a second vehicle, this one a mud-splattered pickup truck. Margaret's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly. Around her coffee mug, the liquid inside now perfectly still, despite the tremor that had been present moments before. She recognized the vehicles, of course. They had passed through town twice in the past week, slowing each time they drove by the sheriff's office, the bank, and finally her inn. Margaret had watched them through the same window, noting the out-of-state plates, the way the men inside seemed to be cataloguing details, surveillance, assessment, planning. She'd seen it before, in another life. The doors opened, and 4 men emerged. From the SUV came 2 figures that immediately stood apart from typical Pinewood visitors. The first was tall and lean, with sharp features and calculating eyes that took in everything around him. He wore an expensive leather jacket despite the mountain chill, designer jeans, and boots that had never seen real work. Beside him, a younger man with a shaved head moved with the coiled energy of someone accustomed to violence, his hand never straying far from the waistband of his jeans. From the pickup emerged a massive man with a thick beard and arms covered in crude tattoos. He laughed at something the 4th man said, a wiry figure with nervous eyes who seemed to be fidgeting with something in his pocket. Margaret set down her coffee cup, noticed the slight tremor had returned to her hands, and took a slow, measured breath. She turned away from the window, righted 4 chairs around a table near the fireplace, and moved behind the reception counter just as the front door opened, bringing with it the scent of pine and the distinct metallic smell of approaching rain. "We're not quite open for breakfast yet," she said, her voice soft but carrying across the empty lobby. "But I can offer you coffee while you wait. Check-in isn't until 3, though." The leader, and Margaret had already identified him as such from the way the others positioned themselves around him, smiled. It was a practiced expression that showed perfect white teeth but contained no warmth. "Not looking for a room just yet, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a slight southern drawl. "Just passing through, thought we'd grab some coffee and maybe some local insight." He approached the counter, moving with the confidence of someone unused to being denied. "Name's Mason Blackwell." Margaret's hands began their familiar trembling as she reached for the coffee pot. The name meant nothing to her, but everything about the man screamed danger. Not to her specifically, not yet, but to Pinewood Valley. She'd seen his type before, in villages across Afghanistan, in small towns in Eastern Europe, in places where people with power preyed on those without. "Margaret Sullivan," she replied, continuing her practiced role of small-town innkeeper. "What brings you gentlemen to our little valley? Not much out this way except for hiking and fishing." "Business opportunities," Blackwell said, watching her hands as she poured coffee into 4 mugs. The tremor was visible, coffee sloshing dangerously close to the rims. "You all right there, Mrs. Sullivan? Seems like you're having a bit of trouble." "Old injury," she replied without elaboration, sliding the mugs across the counter. "Cream and sugar are on the table by the window. If you're interested in business, you might want to talk to Mayor Richardson. His office is just past the General Store on Main Street." The youngest man, the one with the shaved head, snickered. "Oh, we'll be talking to everyone important in this little town. Don't you worry." Margaret kept her expression neutral, but her mind was already calculating, assessing. These men weren't passing through. They hadn't ended up in Pinewood Valley by chance. Their presence was deliberate, their interest in the town specific, and that meant trouble. Sheriff Thomas Banks was enjoying his morning coffee at Clara's diner when Margaret entered. At 64, Banks had been Pinewood's sheriff for nearly 20 years, his grey moustache and weathered face as much a fixture of the town as the mountains themselves. He looked up from his newspaper, his usual friendly smile fading as he caught the look in Margaret's eyes. "Morning, Maggie," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Everything all right at the inn?" Margaret slid into the seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to control their movement. "We have visitors, Tom. 4 men. They're asking about business opportunities in town." Banks set down his coffee, immediately alert. "The same ones who drove through last week. Black SUV?" Margaret nodded. "And a pickup. The leader calls himself Mason Blackwell." The sheriff's expression darkened. "Blackwell? Are you sure about that name?" "That's what he said. Does it mean something to you?" Banks glanced around the nearly empty diner before leaning forward. I got a bulletin from the state police last month. The Blackwell gang has been moving through small towns in Colorado and Wyoming. They start with legitimate business offers, buying property, investing in local establishments. Before long they own half the town, bringing in drugs, protection rackets. 2 towns over in Silver Falls, they nearly took over completely before state police could intervene. Margaret absorbed this information, her face betraying nothing. But beneath the table, her right hand had gone completely still, the tremor vanishing as her muscle memory activated. Sheriff Banks didn't notice the change, just as no one in Pinewood had ever noticed how her tremors disappeared whenever she needed perfect control. "They're at my inn now," she said quietly, "but they'll be making their way around town today, I expect. Watching, evaluating." Banks reached for his radio. "I'll call in Deputy Wilson. Get some extra patrols going." "No," Margaret said quickly, placing her hand on his arm. "Let them think everything is normal. Let them underestimate us." The sheriff gave her a curious look. For a moment, there was something in Margaret Sullivan's eyes that he'd never seen before. A hardness, a calculation that seemed out of place in the gentle widow he'd known for 3 years. "Maggie, these aren't just troublemakers. The Blackwells are dangerous. 3 people died in Silver Falls." She withdrew her hand, and just like that, the tremor returned. The momentary glimpse of something else in her demeanor vanished, replaced by the familiar, slightly stooped posture of the town's resident widow. "You're right, of course," she said, her voice soft again. "I'm just worried about the inn. It's all I have." Banks' expression softened. "Don't you worry. I won't let anything happen to you or your place. You've been through enough already." If only he knew, Margaret thought. As she walked back towards Sullivan's Rest, Margaret allowed herself to observe the town with different eyes than those of the innkeeper she pretended to be. Pinewood Valley was vulnerable in many ways. One main road in and out. The sheriff's office with just Banks and 2 deputies. A volunteer fire department. The mayor, who spent more time fishing than governing. Easy pickings for someone like the Blackwell gang. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The rain that had threatened all morning finally began to fall, a gentle patter against the worn boardwalks of Main Street. Margaret pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, her mind no longer on the weather, but on contingencies, assessments, options she'd hoped never to consider again. As she passed the general store, she noticed the black SUV parked outside. Through the window, she could see Mason Blackwell talking to Ed Harper, the store's owner. Ed's expression was a mixture of confusion and concern. Beside Blackwell stood the large, bearded man, his posture suggesting intimidation rather than conversation. Margaret continued walking, never breaking stride or showing any particular interest in the scene. But she was logging every detail, every nuance. By the time she reached her inn, the pieces were beginning to fall into place. The Blackwell gang wasn't just passing through. They weren't simply looking for a small-town score. They were here to stay, to take over. That night, after her few guests had retired to their rooms, Margaret Sullivan descended to the inn's cellar with a flashlight in her trembling hand. The old building had a foundation of natural stone, the cellar carved partially into the mountainside itself. It was cool and dry year-round, perfect for storage, perfect for keeping secrets. In the farthest corner, behind shelves of preserved fruits and dry goods, Margaret knelt beside what appeared to be an ordinary steamer trunk. Her fingers, still trembling visibly, worked the combination lock with practiced ease. Inside, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, lay the remnants of another life, a high-powered rifle, disassembled but immaculately maintained. 3 handguns of various calibers, boxes of ammunition, a tactical knife, a small kit containing tools for everything from lockpicking to electronic surveillance. All the equipment of Margaret Reynolds, the woman who had disappeared from official records 3 years ago. Her hands hovered over the weapons, the tremor suddenly noticeably absent. With the precision of someone who had performed this action, in countless times, she began to assemble the rifle, each component clicking into place with satisfying certainty. Only when she set it aside and closed the trunk did the tremor return, as if her body remembered which role it was currently playing. Margaret hadn't touched these weapons since arriving in Pinewood. She'd hoped never to need them again. But hope, she had learned long ago, was a luxury rarely afforded to people with her particular set of skills. As she climbed the stairs back to the main floor of the inn, the weight of her decision settled across her shoulders. For 3 years, she had been Margaret Sullivan, widow and innkeeper. She had buried her past along with the ghosts that haunted it. She had found, if not peace, then at least a kind of quiet existence in this mountain town. But the arrival of the Blackwell gang changed everything. They had brought danger to the doorstep of the place she now called home, threatening people who had shown her nothing but kindness. People who accepted her trembling hands without question, who respected her desire for solitude, who never pushed past the boundaries she had so carefully established. Standing in her darkened kitchen, Margaret looked out the window toward the sleeping town of Pinewood Valley. The rain had stopped, and moonlight silvered the distant peaks. It was beautiful, peaceful, everything her previous life had not been. And for the first time in 3 years, Margaret allowed herself to remember exactly who she had been before becoming the widow Sullivan. Before the trembling hands that everyone attributed to grief, but were actually the result of nerve damage from a mission gone wrong in Kandahar. Before she had faked her death rather than accept a desk position after her injury made fieldwork supposedly impossible. Before she had chosen this remote town specifically because it was outside any surveillance grid she had ever encountered. Margaret Steady Hand Reynolds had been a ghost for 3 years. But ghosts, sometimes, had a way of returning when they were needed most. In the quiet of her kitchen, Margaret made coffee with hands that shook visibly. By morning, the Blackwell gang would begin their systematic takeover of Pinewood Valley. They would expect to find a collection of simple townspeople, easy to intimidate, easy to control. What they would never expect was that the trembling widow who served them coffee had once been among the deadliest operatives in the CIA's Special Activities Division. They would never suspect that those shaking hands had, in another life, remained perfectly steady while eliminating targets at distances other snipers considered impossible. They would never imagine that her quiet watchfulness masked a tactical mind that had orchestrated operations across 3 continents. That beneath her modest innkeeper's attire, she carried the mental and physical scars of a career spent in shadows. The Blackwell gang had chosen Pinewood Valley because it seemed vulnerable, isolated, and defenseless. They had made a grave miscalculation. Margaret Sullivan set down her coffee cup, noticed the tremor in her hands, and smiled. For the first time in 3 years, the tremor was no longer her weakness. It was her perfect disguise. Dawn arrived with hesitant fingers of light stretching across Pinewood Valley, illuminating a town that had stood largely unchanged for generations. The main street ran straight as an arrow for 6 blocks, lined with businesses whose hand-painted signs and wooden storefronts harkened back to a simpler time. Harper's General Store anchored the East End, while Clara's Diner marked the western boundary of what locals considered downtown. Between them stood the Pinewood Bank and Trust, the sheriff's office, Murphy's Hardware, the post office, and a smattering of other establishments that served the valley's modest population of 800 souls. Beyond the town proper, dirt. Roads branched off into the surrounding forest, leading to cabins and small farms nestled against the protective embrace of the mountains. The Richardson sawmill, 3 miles north, provided employment for many local men, while others made their living through hunting, guiding, or maintaining the properties of wealthy out-of-towners who visited only during summer months. At the counter of Clara's diner, Frank Murphy sipped his morning coffee while discussing the previous night's town council meeting with Mayor Richardson. At 72, Richardson was serving his fourth term, mainly because no one else wanted the job. "I'm telling you, Frank, those fellas gave me a strange feeling," the mayor said, smoothing his white mustache. "Coming in talking about investment opportunities and untapped potential, making it sound like they're doing us a favor." Murphy nodded, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug. "Blackwell fellow came by the hardware store yesterday afternoon, asked all sorts of questions about property values, who owns what. Seemed mighty interested in the old mining roads up north." "Sheriff Banks says to be careful around them," Clara interjected as she refilled their cups. At 58, Clara Wilson had been running the diner for nearly 30 years, making her establishment the unofficial hub of town information. "Says they've been causing trouble in other small towns." The bell above the door jingled and all. Three turned to see Mason Blackwell enter, followed by his young associate with the shaved head. Conversation throughout the diner quieted noticeably. Blackwell offered a broad smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good morning, folks. Beautiful day in this lovely town of yours." Clara straightened her spine, her expression carefully neutral. "Morning, coffee? That would be perfect, ma'am. And I hear your blueberry pancakes are the best in 3 counties. "Word travels fast," Clara replied, already pouring 2 mugs of coffee. "Take any seat you like." Blackwell chose a booth with a clear view of both the door and the entire diner. His companion sat facing him, his back to the wall. It was a strategic positioning that didn't go unnoticed by Clara, who had been married to a military man before. "Opening her diner, Mayor Richardson," Blackwell called out. "Just the man I was hoping to see. Mind if I have a word after breakfast? I've got some ideas I'd love to share with you." The mayor nodded stiffly. "My office is open till noon." Frank Murphy drained his coffee and stood up. "Best get to the store, delivery coming in today." His eyes met Clara's briefly, communicating volumes without words. He'd be spreading the word. Something wasn't right about these newcomers. Across town at Sullivan's Rest, Margaret was already well into her morning routine. She had risen before dawn, her internal clock still governed by habits formed years ago. The tremor in her hands was particularly pronounced as she prepared breakfast for her guests, but her mind was clear and focused. Through the kitchen window, she observed the black SUV parked outside the bank. The bearded man and the nervous one sat inside, watching the street with practiced attention. They were establishing a presence, making themselves visible while gathering information. Classic intimidation tactics, thinly veiled as business interest. Margaret served breakfast to the Henderson family from Denver, tourists passing through on their way to Yellowstone, with a kind smile and steady conversation about hiking trails and local attractions. Nothing in her demeanor betrayed the calculations running through her mind, the quiet assessment of Pinewood Valley's vulnerabilities and strengths, the identification of potential allies and obstacles. When the dining room emptied, she took her coffee to the front porch, settling into a rocking chair that offered a perfect vantage point of Main Street. From here, she could watch the town while appearing to simply enjoy the morning air. Deputy Sam Wilson, barely 25 and relatively new to his badge, crossed the street toward her, his young face creased with concern. "Morning, Mrs. Sullivan," he said, tipping his hat. "Sheriff asked me to check in, make sure everything's all right with you." Margaret smiled, her amber eyes warm. "That's kind of Tom to worry about, but everything's fine here, Sam. Just enjoying the quiet before the day really begins." Wilson shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "Sheriff says those men staying in town might be trouble. The Blackwells. They came by your place yesterday?" "Just for coffee," Margaret replied, her hands trembling slightly as she raised her cup. "Seemed interested in the town. Ask some questions about property values. Nothing concerning." The deputy's gaze lingered on her shaking hands. Everyone in town knew about Margaret Sullivan's tremor, a combination of grief and some unspecified health condition, they assumed. It made them protective of her, this quiet widow who had appeared in their town 3 years ago and established herself as a kind, if somewhat reserved, member of the community. "Well, if they give you any trouble, you call us right away," Wilson said, his hand resting instinctively on his holster. "Sheriff says they've caused problems elsewhere. I appreciate the concern, Sam. I really do." Margaret's voice was gentle. "But I'm sure everything will be just fine." As Wilson continued his patrol, Margaret's gaze traveled beyond the town limits, to the road, winding up into the mountains. Her inn stood at the edge of town for a reason. It offered a clear view of both Main Street and the only paved route in or out of Pinewood Valley. It also backed up against the forest, providing multiple escape routes if one knew the old hiking trails, which Margaret had meticulously mapped during her first month in town. She had chosen Pinewood Valley carefully after her extraction from Kandahar, after the nerve damage had rendered her shooting hand unreliable and ended her field career. The CIA had been willing to transition her to analysis, to teaching, to any desk position that would utilize her considerable experience without requiring the precision that her injury had compromised. But Margaret Reynolds had known too much, seen too much, done too much to simply accept a different role within the same system. So she had disappeared during a medical transport in Germany, using skills honed through decades of covert operations to vanish completely. Margaret Reynolds had died in that German hospital, according to official records. Margaret Sullivan had emerged 6 months later with carefully constructed identification, a modest inheritance from a fictional deceased husband, and enough cash to purchase a struggling inn in a remote Colorado mountain town. The tremor in her hands had initially been a source of frustration, then resignation, and finally, ironically, a perfect cover. No one would suspect that the widow with the shaking hands had once been one of the CIA's most accomplished operatives. No one would imagine that those same trembling fingers could still, with effort and concentration, perform the delicate work of disarming explosives or assembling a sniper rifle in complete darkness. A truck pulled up in front of the sheriff's office, drawing Margaret's attention back to the present. 2 men she didn't recognize stepped out, not locals, but they carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement. One wore a jacket that identified him as state police. Interesting timing, Margaret thought. Either Sheriff Banks had called in reinforcements, or someone higher up was already aware of the Blackwell gang's movements. She rose from the rocking chair, her decision made. It was time to gather more information, to understand exactly what kind of threat Mason Blackwell and his associates posed, not just to her carefully constructed cover, but to Pinewood Valley itself. Inside, Margaret moved to the reception desk and pulled out the guest registry. 3 rooms occupied, all by tourists passing through, 2 vacancies. She marked one as under maintenance in the computer system, then took a reserved sign and placed it on the door of room 5, the room with the best vantage point of Main Street, and coincidentally, the room directly above her own private quarters. The remaining vacancy would serve as bait if the Blackwell gang was planning to establish a more permanent presence in town. They would need accommodations. Better to have them under her roof, where she could monitor their movements, than elsewhere. Margaret's hand trembled as she closed the registry. But there was a new purpose in the movement now. Not just the involuntary symptom of nerve damage, but a reminder of why she had come to Pinewood Valley in the first place. To disappear, to find peace, to leave behind the violence and shadow games of her former life. Now that life was threatening to intrude on the sanctuary she had built. And Margaret Sullivan, or Reynolds, or whatever name she chose to wear, had never been one to stand by when threats emerged. By mid-morning, Pinewood Valley was buzzing with quiet conversation about the newcomers. Clara's diner had become an informal intelligence hub, with locals dropping by to share observations and concerns. Sheriff Banks had stationed Deputy Wilson on Main Street and taken his other deputy, Luis Ramirez, on a patrol of the outlying properties. Mason Blackwell and his young associate, who locals had heard him refer to as Vince, had spent the morning moving from business to business, introducing themselves as investment consultants, looking to revitalize small towns with untapped potential. They had visited the bank, speaking at length with manager Howard Simmons about local property holdings. They had spent time at the town's only real estate office, charming information out of Wendy Parker about available commercial buildings and land. Meanwhile, their associates, the bearded man now known to be called Decker and the nervous one, identified only as Rabbit, had driven the perimeter of town, stopping occasionally to examine property boundaries or take photos. They had paid particular attention to the old mining roads north of town and the Forest Service access points that connected Pinewood Valley to neighboring communities. Margaret observed much of this activity from various vantage points throughout the morning, never drawing attention to herself, but always positioned to gather information. She served lunch to several regulars at the inn, listening carefully to their conversations about the newcomers, adding pieces to the puzzle she was assembling. "Heard they offered to buy the old Wilson property outright," Frank Murphy told Deputy Ramirez over sandwiches. "Cash deal. Wendy says it was way over market value." Ramirez frowned. "That place has been empty for years. What would they want with it?" "Strategic location," Margaret thought but didn't say aloud. The Wilson property sat at the junction of the main road and the northern access route. Anyone controlling that land would effectively have oversight of all traffic in and out of the valley from that direction. "Sheriff's on the phone with state police," Ramirez continued, lowering his voice. "Sounds like these Blackwell folks have a pattern. They buy up key properties, bring in their own people, start pushing out locals who won't play along. Before long, they're running everything. Legal businesses up front, illegal operations behind the scenes." Murphy shook his head. "Not in Pinewood. We take care of our own here." Margaret refilled their coffee cups, her hands visibly shaking. "More pie, gentlemen?" she offered, her voice soft and unassuming. Both men declined with friendly smiles, their expressions softening as they often did when interacting with her. Margaret had carefully cultivated this response over 3 years, the protective instinct people felt toward a seemingly vulnerable widow. It served her purposes perfectly, allowing her to move through the community, gathering information, while never being perceived as a threat or even a particularly noteworthy presence. After lunch, Margaret closed the inn for her usual afternoon break, a 2-hour window she normally used for ordering supplies, handling paperwork, or sometimes simply reading on her back porch. Today, she had other plans. She drove her modest sedan, a nondescript beige Toyota that blended with the landscape, along the Forest Service road that circles behind the northern properties. To anyone observing, she appeared to be a local taking a peaceful afternoon drive. In reality, she was conducting reconnaissance, noting changes since her last circuit of the area, identifying potential observation points and escape routes. As she rounded a bend near the old fire watchtower, Margaret spotted the mud-splattered pickup belonging to the Blackwell gang. It was parked off-road, partially concealed by pine trees. She drove past without slowing, but her trained eye caught several details: fresh tire tracks suggesting multiple visits, disturbed underbrush indicating foot traffic toward the ridge overlooking town, a cigarette butt of a brand she'd noted. Decker smoking. They were scouting the high ground, establishing fallback positions. This wasn't the behavior of simple criminals or opportunistic businessmen. This was tactical planning by people with either military or law enforcement background. Margaret continued her drive, circling back toward town via a different route. Her mind processed what she had observed, comparing it with patterns she had encountered in her previous life. The Blackwell gang wasn't just looking to exploit a small town economically. They were establishing a base of operations with strategic value. The question was, for what purpose? As she pulled into the inn's gravel parking area, Margaret noticed the black SUV parked in front. Mason Blackwell stood on her front porch, examining the building with the calculating gaze of someone assessing an acquisition rather than admiring architecture. Time to play her role. "Mr. Blackwell," she called out as she exited her car, allowing her voice to waver slightly. "Were you looking for lunch? I'm afraid we're closed until dinner, but I could make an exception." Blackwell turned, offering that same practiced smile that never reached his eyes. "Mrs. Sullivan, no need to trouble yourself. I was actually wondering about accommodations. My associates and I find ourselves needing to extend our stay in your charming town." Margaret fumbled slightly with her keys. The tremor in her hands pronounced, "I do have one room available. The others are either occupied or reserved, I'm afraid." "One room would be perfect for now," Blackwell replied, moving to help her with the door in a gesture that appeared gentlemanly but allowed him to control her physical space. "We have other arrangements for the rest of my team," Margaret allowed him to open the door, noting how he positioned himself to see into the lobby first, another tactical movement disguised as courtesy. "Of course," she said, moving behind the reception desk. "How long will you be staying?" Blackwell's smile widened slightly. "That depends on how our business develops. Let's start with a week." As Margaret processed his credit card and handed him the key to room 3, strategically positioned where she could monitor its occupant from multiple vantage points, she maintained her facade of mild-mannered innkeeper, even as her mind calculated the implications of his extended stay. "Will you be joining us for dinner?" she asked. "We serve from 5 to 8. "Wouldn't miss it," Blackwell replied, pocketing the key. "I hear your cooking is as remarkable as your coffee." There was something in his tone, a subtle shift, an undercurrent of assessment, that made Margaret wonder if her performance had raised any flags. Had she overplayed the tremor? Appeared too accommodating or too nervous? "Just simple home. In cooking," she said, allowing a modest smile. "Nothing fancy." Blackwell studied her for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze lingering on her face, as if trying to read something beneath her expression. "Sometimes the simplest things hide the most complexity, don't you find, Mrs. Sullivan?" Margaret met his gaze with the perfect blend of confusion and politeness. "I suppose that's true of many things in life, Mr. Blackwell." He nodded, apparently satisfied with whatever he had been looking for. "I look forward to dinner and getting to know this town and its residents much better." As he turned to leave, Margaret watched him through the eyes of Margaret Reynolds, CIA operative. His posture, his movement patterns, the subtle scanning of exits and sightlines, all pointed to professional training. This wasn't just a criminal entrepreneur. This was someone with a background similar to her own, and that made him infinitely more dangerous, both to her cover and to Pinewood Valley. The game had changed. Margaret Sullivan, Trembling widow, would need to be even more careful in her performance, because Mason Blackwell wasn't just looking for a town to exploit. He was hunting for something or someone specific. Dinner at Sullivan's Rest proceeded with deceptive normalcy that evening. Margaret moved between kitchen and dining room with practiced efficiency, serving her small group of guests with quiet attention. The Henderson family from Denver occupied one table, discussing their plans to visit Yellowstone the following day. An elderly couple celebrating their anniversary dined by the window, holding hands between courses. A solo traveler, a photographer documenting small-town America, sat in the corner, reviewing images on his camera, and at the table nearest the fireplace, Mason Blackwell ate with the focused appreciation of someone accustomed to much finer. And there, yet finding unexpected pleasure in simpler cuisine. This venison stew is remarkable, Mrs. Sullivan, he commented as Margaret refilled his water glass. Local game? Yes, from last season's hunt, she replied, her hands trembling slightly as she set down the pitcher. Sheriff Banks is generous with his surplus. Blackwell's eyes tracked the movement of her hands with subtle interest. Hunting must be excellent. In these mountains, I imagine there are trails all through these forests that only locals know about. The question beneath the observation wasn't lost on Margaret. He was fishing for information about access routes, terrain knowledge that wouldn't appear on standard maps. I wouldn't know much about that, she answered with an apologetic smile. I'm afraid my outdoor activities are limited to the garden behind the inn. Sheriff or Frank Murphy at the hardware store could tell you more. They lead the hunting. Parties each fall. Blackwell nodded, seemingly satisfied with this redirection. Perhaps I'll speak with them tomorrow. We're considering organizing some hunting expeditions as part of our business venture here. The door opened, bringing with it a gust of cool evening air and the burly frame of Decker, the bearded member of Blackwell's crew. He scanned the room with practiced efficiency before approaching Blackwell's table, leaning down to murmur something in his ear. Margaret busied herself with clearing the Henderson family's empty dessert plates, but her trained hearing caught fragments. Perimeter, setup, and timeline adjusted. Blackwell's expression remained unchanged, but a new tension appeared in his shoulders as he nodded once, dismissing Decker with a barely perceptible gesture. Something had changed in their plans. As the dining room gradually emptied and guests retired to their rooms, Margaret maintained her role as attentive innkeeper, offering information about breakfast hours and local activities for the following day. When only Blackwell remained, lingering over coffee in the now quiet space, she began her nightly cleanup routine, aware of his gaze following her movements. "You run this place entirely alone, Mrs. Sullivan?" he asked finally, his tone conversational, but his attention unnervingly focused. Margaret placed clean glasses on a shelf, her back to him. "I have a local girl who helps with housekeeping 3 mornings a week, Jenny Parker, and old Mr. Winters handles maintenance when needed. Otherwise, yes, it's just me." "That must be difficult, especially with your condition." The slight pause before the last word carried subtle emphasis. Margaret turned, allowing a flicker of what might be interpreted as embarrassment to cross her features. "The tremor, you mean? It's manageable most days. Come and go." "War injury?" Blackwell asked, the question so unexpected that a lesser-trained operative might have revealed something in their reaction. But Margaret had built her cover identity with meticulous care. "Nothing so dramatic," she replied with a soft laugh. "Nerve damage from a car accident, same one that took my husband. The doctors say it might improve with time, but after 3 years..." She let the sentence trail off with just the right note of resigned acceptance. Blackwell studied her with renewed interest. "Yet you managed this entire operation essentially single-handedly. Impressive resilience, Mrs. Sullivan." "Necessity is a powerful motivator, Mr. Blackwell," she answered, her amber eyes meeting his with calculated openness. "The inn was all I had after Thomas died. It forces one to adapt." He nodded slowly, as if weighing this information against some internal standard. "Indeed it does." He stood, leaving a generous tip beside his empty coffee cup. "Thank you for the excellent meal. I look forward to my stay here." "Good night, Mr. Blackwell," Margaret said, her voice pleasant, unassuming. "Breakfast is served." From 6 to 9, after he'd disappeared up the stairs to his room, Margaret completed her closing routine with methodical precision. She locked the front door, turned off the main lights, and checked each window, all normal activities for an innkeeper securing her establishment for the night. Nothing in her movements would have seemed unusual to anyone watching. But as she Moved through the darkened inn, Margaret was cataloguing details, mentally mapping positions, calculating angles and distances. The dining room window to the oak tree outside, 12 feet, the kitchen door to the tree line, 30 yards, with no cover. Blackwell's room to the staircase, 8 steps. In her private quarters behind the kitchen, Margaret closed and locked her door, then stood perfectly still, listening to the old building settle around her. The Hendersons' child was still awake, floorboards creaking rhythmically above as someone paced with the restless youngster. The elderly couple was quiet. The photographer had showered and was now moving around his room, likely organizing equipment, and Blackwell... Margaret tilted her head slightly, focusing her trained hearing. His movements were too deliberate, too measured for someone preparing for bed. He was conducting his own assessment, mapping the building, testing floorboards for noise, likely noting potential entry and exit points. Margaret's suspicions deepened. Mason Blackwell was not simply a criminal entrepreneur. His behavior, his questions, his very presence in Pinewood Valley suggested an operation with specific objectives beyond mere territorial expansion. She moved to her closet, pushing aside hanging clothes to reveal a small digital panel embedded in the wall. Her trembling fingers tapped a 6-digit code, causing a section of the wall to slide back silently. Inside this hidden space, a laptop sat on a narrow shelf, surrounded by communication equipment that would have seemed out of place in a small town. This was Margaret Reynolds' contingency system, secure, untraceable technology that connected to satellites and databases far beyond the reach of ordinary civilians. Equipment she had never expected to use again, but had maintained with the same discipline that had kept her alive through 20 years of covert operations. Her hands hovering over the keyboard, Margaret hesitated. Activating this system would create ripples that might be detected by certain agencies. If she was wrong about the Blackwell gang, if they were simply criminals rather than something more dangerous, she risked exposing her own carefully maintained cover identity for nothing but the pieces didn't fit. Ordinary criminals didn't conduct perimeter assessments. They didn't establish fallback positions with tactical precision. They didn't ask pointed questions about hunting trails and access routes with military objectives in mind. Decision made, Margaret powered up the system. Her fingers, steady now with focused determination, moved across the keyboard, accessing encrypted channels and secure databases that officially didn't exist. She input Mason Blackwell, along with physical descriptors and behavioral patterns she had observed. While the system processed this information, Margaret reached further into the hidden compartment and removed a small case. Inside, nestled in custom-fitted foam, lay a specialized syringe containing a clear liquid. She had prepared this 3 years ago as part of her extraction protocol, a fast-acting compound that would simulate the symptoms of a stroke, providing a cover for her disappearance if her identity was ever compromised. She set it aside, hoping she wouldn't need it, but acknowledging the possibility with the cold pragmatism that had defined her professional life. The laptop chimed softly, drawing her attention back to the screen. The results of her search appeared, confirming her worst suspicions. Mason Blackwell didn't exist in any database prior to 5 years ago. The identity was a construction, just as Margaret Sullivan was a construction. But unlike her carefully crafted cover, Blackwell's showed signs of professional backing, the kind of deep cover identity created by government agencies for covert operations. Margaret's eyes narrowed as she scrolled through the limited information available. The facial recognition system had flagged a possible match, a redacted military file with a 78% probability correlation. Not enough for certainty, but enough to raise serious questions. She dug deeper, accessing channels that required specialized knowledge and protocols that few outside the intelligence community would possess. After 20 minutes of methodical searching, a pattern began to emerge. Fragments of operations in Eastern Europe, traces of classified missions in South America, whispers of a specialized unit tasked with recovering compromised assets. A cold weight settled in Margaret's stomach as understanding dawned. The Blackwell gang wasn't a criminal enterprise targeting a small town for exploitation. They were a recovery team. And they were hunting for someone like a former CIA operative who had disappeared rather than accept retirement. Margaret sat back, her mind racing through possibilities, calculating odds and options. It was possible she wasn't their target. Her extraction and identity change had been meticulous, her trail erased by techniques few could trace. But if not her, then who? Pinewood Valley wasn't exactly a haven for fugitives or disappeared operatives. The sound of a floorboard creaking above her head interrupted her thoughts. Blackwell was on the move. Margaret quickly shut down the system, closed the hidden compartment, and moved to her bedroom, maintaining the pattern of an innkeeper retiring for the night. As she prepared for bed, a performance for anyone who might be monitoring the building, Margaret mentally reviewed what she knew. The Blackwell gang had established a presence in town. They were conducting reconnaissance with military precision. Their interest in local geography and access routes suggested they were preparing for an extraction or containment operation. And their leader carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone with specialized training, all of which pointed to a single, disturbing conclusion. Pinewood Valley had become an operational theater. And whether Margaret was the target or not, the community she had come to think of as home was now caught in the crossfire of something far more dangerous than simple criminal activity. Sleep eluded her as she lay in bed, her mind continuing to process information and formulate contingencies. The tremor in her hands manifested even in rest, a constant reminder of what she had lost and what she still carried with her. By dawn, Margaret had reached a decision. If Pinewood Valley was under threat, she could no longer remain passive. Regardless of the risk to her cover identity, it was time to prepare for conflict, and that meant reconnecting with skills she had deliberately left dormant for 3 years. The following morning brought a subtle but significant change to the atmosphere. In Pinewood Valley, as Margaret served breakfast to her guests, she noted new faces in town, men whose careful casualness marked them as clearly as uniforms would have. They arrived in pairs, checking into the valley's only motel or renting cabins on the outskirts of town. To untrained eyes, they might have passed for tourists or seasonal workers. To Margaret, they were unmistakably operatives, establishing a perimeter. Blackwell appeared for breakfast precisely at 7, dressed in hiking clothes that looked expensive but appropriate for the setting. "Good morning, Mrs. Sullivan," he greeted her with practiced charm. "I thought I'd explore some of the local trails today. Any recommendations?" "Blue Ridge Trail is popular this time of year," Margaret replied, pouring his coffee with hands that trembled noticeably. "Beautiful views of the valley from the lookout point. The trailhead is about a mile north, clearly marked." She deliberately suggested the most public and frequently used trail, one that offered limited tactical advantage and would be easily monitored by locals. If Blackwell and his team were conducting serious reconnaissance, they would ignore her suggestion and seek out the more remote paths, which would tell her something about their objectives. "Sounds perfect," he replied, though something in his expression suggested he had already mapped every trail within 20 miles of town. "Perhaps you could join me sometime. I imagine you know all the special spots around here after 3 years. The invitation carried a subtle probe beneath its surface pleasantry, testing her physical capabilities, perhaps, or seeking to isolate her from the protection of public spaces. "That's very kind," Margaret answered with an apologetic smile, "but I'm afraid these old legs don't handle elevation well anymore. My exploring days are mostly behind me." Blackwell's eyes lingered on her trembling hands as she set a plate of eggs and bacon before him. "Some limitations can be overcome with the right motivation, don't you find, Mrs. Sullivan?" The comment hung in the air between them, loaded with potential meaning. Margaret allowed a moment of confusion to cross her features. "I suppose that's true of many things, Mr. Blackwell." Their exchange was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Banks, who entered the dining room with the comfortable familiarity of a regular. "Morning, Maggie," he called, hanging his hat on the rack by the door. "Coffee smells even better than usual today." Margaret welcomed the interruption, moving to pour the sheriff's usual cup. "Just made fresh, Tom. The usual breakfast?" "You know me too well," Banks replied, taking his customary table near the kitchen door. His position offered a clear view of Blackwell, a placement that wasn't accidental. The sheriff nodded acknowledgement to the newcomer, his expression professionally neutral. Blackwell returned the nod, his own expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. The two men assessed each other with the wariness of territorial predators, cloaked beneath a veneer of small-town courtesy. "Sheriff Banks," Blackwell said, after a moment, "I've been meaning to stop by your office. I understand there might be some concerns about our presence in Pinewood." Banks accepted his coffee from Margaret with a nod of thanks. "Just doing my job, Mr. Blackwell. Small town like this, we notice new folks, especially when they show particular interest in our community." "Perfectly understandable," Blackwell replied smoothly. "Transparency is important to us. I'd be happy to discuss our business intentions in detail, perhaps later today." "My door's always open," Banks said, his tone making it clear the conversation wasn't optional. Margaret retreated to the kitchen, ostensibly to prepare the sheriff's breakfast, but her mind was racing with new calculations. Banks was no fool. He'd recognized something in the Blackwell gang that warranted caution. The state police visit yesterday suggested he'd already taken steps to secure additional resources. But if Blackwell and his team were what Margaret suspected, a specialized recovery unit with government backing, local law enforcement would be dangerously outmatched. She needed to verify her suspicions, and quickly, and that meant taking risks she'd hoped never to face again. As she plated the sheriff's breakfast, Margaret made a decision. After serving Banks, she approached Blackwell's table once more, her hands visibly unsteady as she refilled his coffee. "Mr. Blackwell," she began, her voice pitched just right, hesitant but determined, the tone of someone stepping outside their comfort zone. "I've been thinking about your business interests here in Pinewood. If you're looking for property, there's an old cabin on my land that might suit some of your needs. It was my husband's workshop, but it's been sitting empty since he passed. It has good road access and privacy." Blackwell's expression registered subtle surprise, not at the offer itself, but at her initiative in making it. "That's extremely generous, Mrs. Sullivan. I'd be very interested in seeing it. I could show you after breakfast, if you'd like," Margaret offered, allowing a nervous glance toward the sheriff, as if worried about his reaction to her dealing with the newcomers he clearly distrusted. Blackwell followed her gaze, his lips curving in a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Perfect. Say, 30 minutes?" Margaret nodded, then moved away to attend to her other guests. She could feel Banks watching her with concern, and knew she would need to offer him some explanation later. But for now, she had created an opportunity to test Blackwell directly, to observe him in a controlled environment of her choosing. The cabin she had mentioned was real enough, a solid structure a quarter-mile behind the inn, at the edge of the forest that climbed toward the mountains. What Blackwell couldn't know was that Margaret had converted it into a secure location shortly after purchasing the property. Beneath its rustic appearance lay reinforced walls, hidden surveillance equipment, and emergency supplies that would sustain someone for weeks if necessary. It was a safe house, designed by a woman who understood that safety often depended on preparation for the worst-case scenario. A woman who had never truly believed her past would remain buried forever. As she cleared dishes and chatted with the Henderson family about their travel plans, Margaret's mind worked through the implications of her decision. She was accelerating the timeline, forcing Blackwell's hand by offering direct access to her property. It was a calculated risk. If he was indeed hunting for Margaret Reynolds, this might confirm his suspicions. But it would also reveal his true objectives more quickly than passive observation would allow. And in the chess game that was unfolding in Pinewood Valley, understanding her opponent's strategy had become critically important, not just for her own survival, but for the safety of the community that had unwittingly provided her sanctuary for 3 years. The stage was set. In 30 minutes, she would lead Mason Blackwell directly into territory she controlled. And there, away from public eyes, the first real move in their dangerous game would begin. The path to the cabin wound through a stand of mature pines that provided natural privacy from both the inn and the main road. Margaret led the way, maintaining her innkeeper persona with practiced ease as she pointed out native plants and mentioned the history of the property. Her cardigan was buttoned against the morning chill, concealing the slim ceramic knife strapped to her forearm. Not her preferred weapon, but one that wouldn't trigger metal detectors and could be explained away as a gardening tool if discovered. Blackwell followed a precise 3 steps behind her, his attention divided between Margaret and their surroundings. He moved with the measured awareness of someone conducting continuous threat assessment, another confirmation of Margaret's suspicions about his background. "My husband built the cabin himself," she explained as they approached the structure. "He was quite handy that way, always needed a project to keep busy." The cabin stood in a small clearing, its exterior weathered to a silvery grey that blended with the surrounding forest. A covered porch wrapped around 2 sides, offering views of both the approach path and the mountains beyond. To casual observation, it appeared to be exactly what Margaret had described, a workshop and retreat for a man who enjoyed solitude. "It's larger than I expected," Blackwell commented, his eyes tracking sightlines and access points with professional assessment. "Thomas had big plans," Margaret replied, fumbling slightly with the key, her trembling hands providing the perfect cover for the deliberate way she positioned herself to observe Blackwell's reaction as the door swung open. He was going to retire early, spend his days woodworking and fishing. Inside, the cabin presented a carefully curated image of abandoned potential. Woodworking tools hung on wall-mounted pegboards. A half-finished rocking chair sat on a workbench, gathering dust. Fishing. Gear stood in one corner beside a stone fireplace. Everything suggested a life interrupted, projects left eternally unfinished when death intervened. What wasn't visible were the reinforced walls, the hidden surveillance system that had activated when Margaret unlocked the door, or the concealed panic room accessible through what appeared to be a storage closet. "It has electricity and running water," Margaret continued, moving to open curtains that hadn't been disturbed in months. "The generator needs servicing, but it worked fine last time I checked. I don't come out here much anymore. Too many memories." Blackwell moved through the space with deceptive casualness, but Margaret noted how he catalogued exits, angles, and defensive positions. He tapped the walls at strategic points, his expression revealing nothing when solid hardwood failed to produce the hollow sound an ordinary cabin might have yielded. "It has potential," he said finally, turning to face her. "What exactly did you have in mind for its use, Mrs. Sullivan?" Margaret allowed uncertainty to cross her features, as if she hadn't thought that far ahead. "I'm not entirely sure. Rental, income perhaps, or if your business requires office space away from town." She let the suggestion hang in the air, another test to see how he would respond. Blackwell smiled, the expression calculated rather than genuine. "Actually, We might be interested in something more comprehensive. Your entire property has unique advantages: strategic location, privacy, established business. He paused, watching her closely. Have you ever considered selling? I could make a very generous offer. Now they reached the heart of it, his first significant move in their unspoken game. Margaret feigned surprise, then consideration, her trembling hands clutching her cardigan closed. I haven't thought about leaving, she said, her voice carefully modulated to suggest emotional attachment, battling with practical considerations. This place has been my sanctuary since Thomas died. I'm not sure I could just walk away. Everyone has their price, Mrs. Sullivan, Blackwell replied, his tone conversational, but his eyes sharp with assessment. And sometimes a fresh start is exactly what a person needs. No painful memories, no small-town scrutiny, complete reinvention. The offer carried layered meaning that Margaret understood perfectly. He was presenting a potential exit, one that would allow Margaret Sullivan to disappear cleanly, without raising questions that might expose Margaret Reynolds. It was the approach a professional would take when extracting an asset they wanted to keep cooperative, which meant either he hadn't confirmed her identity yet and was fishing, or he was under orders to bring her in undamaged if possible. It's a significant decision, she answered, allowing genuine consideration to show in her expression. I'd need time to think about it. Of course, Blackwell nodded, his posture relaxing slightly. Take all the time you need. We'll be in Pinewood for the foreseeable future, evaluating multiple opportunities. The implied pressure beneath his courtesy was clear. This offer had an expiration date. As they walked back toward the inn, Margaret mentally processed this exchange. Blackwell's interest in her property wasn't incidental or merely tactical. It was targeted. The question remained whether he was specifically hunting for Margaret Reynolds, or if Sullivan's Rest had simply caught his attention because of its strategic value to whatever operation he was conducting. Either way, the situation had accelerated beyond passive observation. Margaret would need to take more active measures, both to protect her cover identity and to understand exactly what threat Blackwell posed to Pinewood Valley. Sheriff Banks was waiting on the inn's front porch when they returned, his cruiser parked prominently in the gravel lot. His expression registered concern when he saw Margaret and Blackwell emerging from the tree line together. "Morning, Tom," Margaret called, maintaining her role perfectly. "Just showing Mr. Blackwell the old cabin. He might be interested in renting it." Banks nodded, his eyes moving between them with poorly concealed suspicion. "Maggie, got a minute? Need to ask about that pie for the church social tomorrow." The pretext was transparent, but Margaret played along, excusing herself from Blackwell with appropriate politeness before joining the sheriff on the porch. "You should be careful around him, Maggie," Banks said quietly, once Blackwell had entered the inn. "Got some information back from the state police this morning. The Blackwell gang isn't just any criminal outfit. They've been connected to some serious operations. Weapons trafficking, high-level extortion, even suspected government contract work." Margaret allowed an appropriate alarm to show on her face. "Government work? What does that mean?" Banks shook his head, frustration evident in his expression. "Not entirely clear. Some suggest they've worked as contractors in situations where official agencies need deniability. Point is, these aren't just thugs. They're organized, professional, and potentially very dangerous." "Should I be worried about having him as a guest?" Margaret asked, her hands trembling more pronouncedly now, a reaction that Banks would attribute to fear rather than the strategic calculations racing through her mind. The sheriff placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We've got extra patrols in place, and I've requested additional support from the state. Just be cautious. Don't go off alone with any of them again, you hear?" Margaret nodded, allowing her expression to shift from alarm to embarrassment. "I just thought, the cabin's been sitting empty for so long. Might as well get some use from it." Your heart's in the right place, Maggie. Always is. Banks squeezed her shoulder gently. But these aren't the kind of people you want to get tangled up with. Let me and the deputies handle them. After the sheriff departed, Margaret returned to her inn with her mind working on multiple tracks simultaneously. Banks had inadvertently confirmed her worst suspicions. The Blackwell gang had connections to government operations, precisely the type of team that might be tasked with recovering a former agent who had gone off the grid. In her kitchen, Margaret methodically prepared lunch for her remaining guests, the familiar routine helping to mask the intensity of her strategic planning. The Hendersons would check out by noon, leaving only the photographer and Blackwell himself as overnight guests. The reduced occupancy would provide more freedom of movement, more opportunity to implement the contingencies she had been mentally mapping since Blackwell's arrival. As she chopped vegetables for a soup, her hands trembled visibly. A casual observer would see only a woman struggling with a physical limitation. They wouldn't notice how, at precise intervals, the tremor ceased entirely as she executed cuts that required perfect control, only to resume immediately afterward. The tremor had become more than just a symptom of her injury or a component of her cover identity. It had evolved into a tool, a visual distraction that kept people from looking deeper, from recognizing the predator that still existed beneath Margaret Sullivan's unassuming exterior. By mid-afternoon, Margaret had finalized her immediate strategy. If Blackwell was indeed hunting for Margaret Reynolds, she needed to determine how much he already knew and what his extraction parameters might be. That meant accessing his room during his absence, a significant risk, but one that offered the highest probability of actionable intelligence. She monitored his movements throughout the day, noting when he left the inn to meet with his associates at the town's small cafe. The timing gave her approximately 90 minutes to conduct a search without interruption. Moving with the efficiency that had once made her one of the CIA's most effective field operatives, Margaret entered Blackwell's room using her master key. Her hands, steady now with focused purpose, moved methodically through his belongings, searching for anything that might confirm his mission parameters. His luggage revealed little: expensive but generic clothing, toiletries appropriate for his cover identity. His laptop was password protected and likely encrypted beyond what she could access without specialized equipment. His phone would be similarly secured. But beneath the mattress, Margaret discovered a satellite phone, not the commercial variety available to civilians, but a specialized unit used for secure communications by intelligence agencies and military special operations. It confirmed her suspicions about Blackwell's connections and resources. More telling was a small notebook tucked inside the lining of his suitcase. The pages contained what appeared to be random numbers and letters, but Margaret immediately recognized a particular encryption methodology, one used by certain government agencies for field operations. She couldn't decode it on the spot, but she photographed several pages using a miniature camera concealed in her watch, another relic of her former life that she had maintained out of ingrained caution. She was replacing the notebook in its hiding place when she heard footsteps on the stairs, too soon for Blackwell's return, based on her observations of his previous patterns. Margaret completed her task with calm precision, then moved to the adjoining bathroom, turning on the water as if she were performing routine housekeeping. The door opened, and Vince, Blackwell's young associate with the shaved head, entered the room. Margaret emerged from the bathroom with a stack of fresh towels, her expression registering appropriate surprise. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice flustered, hands trembling as she clutched the towels. "I thought the room was empty, just doing the afternoon turn-down service." Vince's hand had moved instinctively toward his waistband, where Margaret had already noted he carried a concealed weapon before he registered her identity. His posture relaxed slightly, but suspicion remained in his eyes. "No problem. Ma'am," he said, his tone casual but his attention focused. "Don't let me interrupt your work." Margaret moved toward the door, projecting embarrassment and nervous energy. "All done anyway. Fresh towels are there. Let me know if you need anything else." As she hurried down the hallway toward the linen closet, Margaret processed this encounter with cold efficiency. Vince's presence in Blackwell's room suggested they were operating on a partner system, standard procedure for high-risk operations where team members needed to monitor each other as much as their targets. It also indicated that their timeline might be accelerating if they were changing established patterns. In her private quarters, Margaret downloaded the photographs she had taken to her secure laptop, then ran them through decryption software she had maintained but never expected to use again. The process would take time, but it might provide crucial information about Blackwell's mission parameters and reporting structure. While the program worked, Margaret conducted a thorough check of her own security measures. The surveillance system covering the inn's perimeter showed no signs of tampering. The emergency kit she had prepared 3 years ago, containing cash, identity documents, weapons and survival supplies, remained intact and accessible. The escape routes she had mapped and memorized when first purchasing the property were still viable. But as Margaret completed these preparations, an unfamiliar sensation settled in her chest: reluctance. 3 years ago, when she had established her cover identity in Pinewood Valley, she had done so with the clinical detachment of an operative creating a necessary safe house. The community had been a tactical choice, not an emotional one. Somewhere along the way, that had changed. Margaret Sullivan had begun as a fabrication, a cover identity built on careful research and strategic necessity. But the relationships she had formed with Sheriff Banks, with Clara from the diner, with the families whose children stayed at her inn during summer fishing trips, had evolved into something genuine. For the first time in a career built on emotional distance, Margaret found herself facing a decision that wasn't purely tactical. If Blackwell and his team were indeed hunting for Margaret Reynolds, her contingency plan had always been clear. Disappear again, establish a new identity in a new location, abandon the compromise without hesitation. But abandoning Pinewood Valley no longer felt like simply burning a cover identity. It felt like leaving home. This realization brought both clarity and complication to her strategic calculus. If she chose to protect both her identity and the community that had unwittingly harbored her, she would need to take more aggressive action than simply disappearing. She would need to neutralize the threat Blackwell represented, not just to her cover, but to Pinewood Valley itself. The decryption program chimed softly, drawing her attention back to the laptop. The results confirmed her worst fears. The Shai's decoded fragments contained operational directives consistent with a high-priority asset recovery mission. Phrases like "extraction authorized" and "target confirmation pending" leapt from the screen. Along with a code designation she recognized from her former agency, they were hunting for Margaret Reynolds, and they had tracked her to Pinewood Valley. What remained unclear was whether Blackwell had definitively identified her as his target, or if he was still in the confirmation phase of his operation. Either way, time was running short. Once he received authorization, extraction would follow swiftly, and if Margaret Reynolds resisted, the protocols typically authorized escalating levels of force, which meant Pinewood Valley could become collateral damage in an operation the local sheriff and his deputies were utterly unprepared to counter. Margaret's trembling hands stilled as she closed the laptop and locked it away in its hidden compartment. The time for passive observation had ended. If she wanted to protect both her identity and the community that had become her home, she would need to draw on skills she had deliberately left dormant for 3 years. Skills that had once made her one of the most effective and feared operatives in the field. As she returned to her innkeeper duties, checking supplies and preparing for dinner service, Margaret's mind worked through scenarios and contingencies with the cold precision that had once been her professional hallmark. Beneath the trembling, hands and unassuming demeanour of Margaret Sullivan, widow and innkeeper, Margaret Reynolds was awakening, calculating, assessing, preparing for conflict. The Blackwell gang had come to Pinewood Valley, hunting for a ghost from the past. What they didn't realize was that ghosts sometimes fought back, and this particular ghost had spent decades learning how to win against impossible odds. Evening fell over Pinewood Valley, bringing with it a gentle rain that misted the pine forests and coated Main Street with a slick sheen. From her position, at the inn's kitchen window, Margaret observed new arrivals to town, 2 more pairs of men whose movements and posture marked them as part of Blackwell's operation. The perimeter was tightening. The extraction team was assembling. Tomorrow would bring decisions that couldn't be undone, actions from which there would be no retreat. Margaret Sullivan, with her trembling hands and quiet demeanour, might soon need to disappear forever. And in her place would stand Margaret Reynolds, steady-handed, precise, and infinitely dangerous to those who threatened what she had built. For tonight, though, she would maintain her cover. She would serve dinner to her guests with shaking hands. She would play the role of unassuming widow to perfection, and she would prepare for war. The dining room at Sullivan's Rest was unusually quiet that evening. The Henderson family had departed after lunch. The elderly couple had opted to dine in Silver Falls, 17 miles down the valley, and the photographer had mentioned photographing sunset over the mountains. That left only Mason Blackwell seated beside the stone fireplace, methodically working through a plate of Margaret's pot roast, while rain tapped against the windows. Margaret moved between kitchen and dining room with practiced efficiency, the tremor in her hands visible as she refilled Blackwell's water glass. She had deliberately chosen to serve him herself rather than call in Jenny Parker, the local girl who occasionally helped with busy evenings. The fewer civilians involved, the better. "This is exceptional, Mrs. Sullivan," Blackwell commented, gesturing toward his plate. "You're full of surprising talents." "Just an old family recipe," Margaret replied, her voice modulated to convey appropriate modesty. "Nothing special." Blackwell set down his fork, his sharp gaze fixing on her face with new intensity. "I disagree. There's nothing just about you." "Is there?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with unspoken meaning. Margaret allowed confusion to cross her features, her trembling hand clutching the water pitcher more tightly. "I'm not sure what you mean, Mr. Blackwell." He smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "A widow who single-handedly runs an inn in a remote location, who maintains a property that would challenge someone half her age, who notices details most people overlook." He picked up his knife, slicing into the pot roast with surgical precision. "People like you fascinate me." "I'm really quite ordinary," Margaret countered, her posture shifting subtly to what might appear to be discomfort, but was actually a defensive position that would allow rapid response if necessary. "Just doing what needs to be done to survive." "Survival," Blackwell echoed, nodding slowly. "That's exactly it, the most fundamental instinct, and yet some people elevate it to an art form." The conversational minefield was becoming more treacherous with each exchange. Margaret recognized the technique, verbal probing, designed to provoke revealing responses. She had used it herself in previous operations, gradually applying pressure, until targets betrayed themselves through word or gesture. "More pot roast?" she offered, deliberately changing the subject. "No, thank you." Blackwell set down his utensils with careful precision. "But I would appreciate some information." "About local attractions? I have brochures at the front desk. About Margaret Reynolds." The name landed like a physical blow in the quiet room. 3 years of careful construction, of meticulous cover maintenance, challenged by 2 simple words. Margaret allowed herself a moment of genuine confusion, the expected reaction from someone hearing an unfamiliar name. "I'm sorry, is that someone local?" Blackwell's expression remained unchanged, his eyes never leaving her face. "Not exactly local, no. But someone with connections to this area, someone of significant interest to the people I represent." Margaret set the water pitcher on the table, her hands trembling visibly. "I'm afraid I can't help you, Mr. Blackwell. I don't know anyone by that name. Really." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a photograph, placing it on the table between them. "Because she bears a remarkable resemblance to you." Margaret glanced down at the image, a surveillance photo taken in Prague nearly 5 years ago, before her final mission, before the injury that had ended her field career. The woman in the photo had darker hair, sharper features unmarked by the subtle cosmetic alterations Margaret had undergone during her identity transition, but the resemblance was undeniable. "I don't understand," Margaret said, allowing her voice to waver with what would appear to be confusion and alarm. "That's not me. I've never been to wherever that is." "Prague," Blackwell supplied. 2019, during a rather delicate situation involving certain diplomatic assets. Margaret shook her head, taking a step back from the table. "There must be some mistake. I was in Seattle in 2019, caring for Thomas through his final illness. I have medical records, death certificates." Her trembling hands clutched at her apron, the perfect picture of a distressed widow confronted with inexplicable accusations. Blackwell studied her reaction with clinical detachment. "Remarkable," he said finally. "Either the most convincing performance I've ever witnessed, or a case of extraordinary coincidence." He tucked the photograph back into his pocket. "Time will tell." "Which it is." The implicit threat in his words was clear. He hadn't conclusively confirmed her identity, but suspicions had crystallized into active investigation. The extraction timetable would be accelerating. "Mr. Blackwell," Margaret began, injecting a note of confused indignation into her voice, "I don't know what kind of business you're really in, but I'm a simple innkeeper. Whatever you think I am, or whoever you think I know, you're mistaken." He stood, towering over her smaller frame with deliberate intimidation. "For your sake, Mrs. Sullivan, I hope that's true. Because Margaret Reynolds is a dangerous woman to be associated with. People connected to her tend to experience unfortunate accidents." The threat hung in the air, all pretense of polite business interest abandoned. Blackwell was showing his hand, applying direct pressure to see how she would respond. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Blackwell?" Margaret asked, her voice small, but with a thread of steel running beneath that would be dismissed as simple courage, rather than the combat-ready awareness it actually signaled. "Quite the opposite," he replied smoothly. "I'm trying to protect you and this charming town from potential complications. If you do happen to know anything about Margaret Reynolds, or if she's contacted you, sharing that information would be in everyone's best interest." Margaret straightened her spine, the picture of an ordinary woman finding courage in the face of intimidation. "I've told you the truth. I don't know this woman, and I think it's time for you to leave my inn." Blackwell's smile was cold. "Unfortunately, I've paid through the week, but I respect your position, Mrs. Sullivan." He placed a folded bill on the table, far more than the meal warranted. "Dinner was excellent. Perhaps by morning your memory might improve." As he climbed the stairs to his room, Margaret remained in the dining room, her body language projecting distress and confusion for the benefit of anyone watching. Inside, her mind was ice-cold, processing this development with tactical precision. Blackwell had moved from passive investigation to active confrontation, which meant his operation was entering a new phase. The photograph proved they had files. on Margaret Reynolds, but his approach suggested he hadn't received absolute confirmation of her identity. He was pushing for a reaction, hoping to force a revealing response. He had also escalated to open threats against both her and Pinewood Valley, a standard pressure tactic, but one that changed the operational parameters significantly. If Blackwell was willing to threaten civilian safety to complete his mission, the potential for collateral damage had increased exponentially. Margaret cleared the dining room with methodical movements, maintaining her cover while calculating response options. She had expected to have more time before direct confrontation. Now, she needed to accelerate her own preparations. In her private quarters, Margaret secured the door before moving to the hidden compartment that contained her emergency supplies. Her hands were perfectly steady now as she quickly assembled a tactical kit, items that could be concealed beneath ordinary clothing but would provide critical advantages if the situation deteriorated further. A ceramic knife strapped to her forearm, a garrote wire disguised as an ordinary hair tie, a small canister of weaponized pepper spray that could incapacitate multiple attackers in enclosed spaces, a phone with encrypted communications capabilities, powered off to prevent tracking. As she prepared these items, Margaret's mind was already mapping contingency plans. If Blackwell attempted extraction tonight, her primary defensive position would be the inn itself, where she had established multiple security measures and escape routes. If he waited until morning, trying to catch her away from familiar territory, she would need to adapt accordingly. Either way, the first confrontation had occurred. The next move would determine whether Margaret Sullivan could maintain her cover identity or whether Margaret Reynolds would need to emerge fully to protect both herself and the community that had unwittingly harbored her. A soft tap at her door interrupted these preparations. Margaret quickly concealed the tactical items and moved to answer, her hands resuming their characteristic tremor as she turned the knob. Sheriff Banks stood on the threshold, his weathered face creased with concern. "Evening, Maggie. Thought I'd stop by, make sure everything's all right." Margaret adjusted her expression to show appropriate weariness and mild distress. "Tom, come in. I was just making some tea." She led him to her small sitting area, deliberately letting him see her trembling hands as she prepared 2 cups. Banks watched with the attentiveness of someone who had spent decades observing human behavior, missing little. "Something happened," he said, not a question, but a statement. "What did Blackwell do?" Margaret hesitated, calculating how much to reveal. Banks was an ally, perhaps the strongest one she had in Pinewood Valley, but involving him too deeply could put him at risk. "He asked me about someone," she said finally. "A woman named Margaret Reynolds. Showed me a photograph of someone who looked a bit like me, but wasn't. Seemed convinced I might know her." Banks frowned, his hand unconsciously moving to rest near his holster. "And do you?" "No." The lie came easily, wrapped in enough truth to be convincing. "I've never heard the name before, but he was insistent, almost threatening." The sheriff's expression darkened. "That crosses a line. I can have him removed from town." "No," Margaret interrupted, perhaps too quickly. She modulated her tone to sound concerned rather than commanding. "I don't think that's necessary yet. He paid through the week, and he didn't actually do anything, just asked questions in an unpleasant way." Banks studied her face. "Maggie, if you're afraid—" "Not afraid," she corrected him gently. "Just unsettled. He'll be gone soon enough." The sheriff didn't appear convinced. "I don't like this, Maggie. First they show up asking about business opportunities. Now they're questioning you about some stranger. None of it adds up." "I know," Margaret agreed, her trembling hands wrapped around her teacup. "But confronting them directly might escalate things. Let's just wait them out. They'll lose interest when they realize there's nothing for them here." Banks sipped his tea in silence for a moment, then set the cup down decisively. I'm putting a deputy on patrol past the inn tonight, every hour, and I want you to call me immediately if anything else happens, no matter how small it seems. Understood? Margaret nodded, projecting grateful vulnerability. Thanks, Tom. I appreciate that. After the sheriff left, Margaret returned to her preparations with renewed urgency. Banks's increased patrols were well-intentioned but potentially complicated matters. If Blackwell made his move tonight, the deputy might become collateral damage in an operation he couldn't possibly understand. She needed to control the battlefield, to choose the time and place of the next confrontation rather than waiting for Blackwell to act. That meant taking a calculated risk, one that might expose her cover identity but would draw Blackwell's focus away from Pinewood Valley itself. Moving to her secure laptop, Margaret accessed files she had maintained but hoped never to use. Contingency plans for various compromise scenarios, including protocols for controlled exfiltration that would minimize civilian exposure. She selected an appropriate protocol and began adapting it to current circumstances. By dawn, she would be ready to implement a plan that would force Blackwell to follow her away from Pinewood Valley, containing the threat before it could engulf the community. As she worked, rain continued to patter against the windows. The gentle sound at odds with the deadly calculations unfolding within. The tremor in her hands came and went, sometimes the genuine symptom of nerve damage, sometimes the practiced affectation of her cover identity, but increasingly irrelevant to the operational planning now consuming her focus. Margaret Reynolds was fully awake now. 3 years of carefully maintained disguise, giving way to the cold precision that had once made her a legend within agencies that officially denied her existence. The night deepened as she finalized her preparations. Occasionally she paused at her window to track the deputy's patrol car as it passed the inn, its headlights sweeping briefly across the rain-slicked gravel before continuing toward town. She also noted the black SUV parked across the road just beyond the property line, Blackwell's men establishing observation positions, monitoring her movements. At 2:17 a.m., Margaret detected movement on her security system, a figure approaching. The inn from the forest behind the property. The intruder moved with tactical discipline, using natural cover and avoiding direct sight lines from the main building. Within minutes, they had reached the back entrance to the kitchen, where they paused to examine the lock. Margaret watched on her monitoring system, coldly assessing the intruder's approach. From the build and movement patterns, she identified him as Vince, Blackwell's young associate. His approach suggested technical training in covert entry, not the work of a common criminal, but of someone with specialized background. She had anticipated this probe, a logical follow-up to Blackwell's confrontation at dinner. Now that he had openly questioned her, he would seek additional evidence to confirm or refute her identity. Vince's mission was likely reconnaissance and intelligence gathering, searching for anything that might connect Margaret Sullivan to Margaret Reynolds. Margaret had prepared accordingly. Her most sensitive equipment was secured in hidden compartments that would resist casual discovery. Her emergency supplies were concealed within ordinary household items. Even her weapon cache had been redistributed to locations that would defeat standard search patterns. What remained was to decide how to respond to this intrusion. She could allow Vince to enter, conduct his search, and leave. The passive approach, maintaining her cover at the cost of revealing she was aware of their surveillance. Or she could confront him directly, a higher-risk option that might accelerate Blackwell's timeline but would establish clear boundaries. Decision made, Margaret moved silently through her darkened quarters to the kitchen, positioning herself in the shadows beside the refrigerator. Her hands were perfectly steady, the tremor entirely absent as adrenaline and training overrode the nerve damage that plagued her in quieter moments. The lock clicked softly as Vince defeated it with practiced skill. The door opened a fraction of an inch, paused as he checked for alarms or monitoring systems, then swung inward with minimal sound. His silhouette filled the doorway momentarily before he slipped inside, closing the door behind him. In the darkness, Vince paused to allow his eyes to adjust, his hand resting near the weapon, concealed beneath his jacket. He took one step forward, then froze as the unmistakable pressure of a knife blade touched the base of his skull. Moving would be unwise, Margaret whispered, her voice entirely different from the gentle tones of the innkeeper, cold, precise, and carrying absolute authority. Hands where I can see them. Slowly. Vince complied, raising his hands to shoulder height, with the careful movements of someone who understood exactly how precarious his position was. "Mrs. Sullivan," he began, his voice steady despite the knife at his neck, "there seems to be a misunderstanding." "No misunderstandings," Margaret cut him off. "Only poor operational decisions. Your entry technique needs refinement. The alarm system you bypassed was a decoy." The subtle shift in her language from civilian to professional was deliberate, a test to gauge his reaction. She felt the slight tensing in his muscles as he processed her words. "You're her," he said quietly. "Reynolds." Margaret didn't confirm or deny, maintaining the knife's position with unwavering precision. "What I am is a property owner who caught an intruder. The question is what happens next." "Blackwell just wants to talk," Vince offered, his tone suggesting he understood the rules of engagement had suddenly changed. No extraction planned without authorization. "Yet here you are, conducting unauthorized surveillance and entry," Margaret countered. "Not exactly building trust, is it?" Vince remained, still his breathing controlled. "Standard protocol for identity confirmation, non-invasive intelligence gathering. There's nothing non-invasive about breaking into my home." Margaret applied slightly more pressure with the knife, not enough to break skin, but sufficient to emphasize her point. "So here's what happens now. You're going to leave exactly the way you came in. You'll tell Blackwell that if he wants to talk, he can do so at a reasonable hour, without sending his people to invade my privacy. And if anyone approaches this building uninvited again tonight, the consequences will be significantly less pleasant than our current conversation. Are we clear?" "Crystal," Vince replied, professional enough to recognize when a tactical retreat was the only viable option. "Good." Margaret withdrew the knife but maintained a ready position. "Now go, and remember." "I'll be watching." Vince backed toward the door, his movements careful and deliberate. At the threshold, he paused. He'll still want confirmation. "Then he can ask for it directly," Margaret responded. "Like a professional, not a common burglar." After Vince disappeared into the rainy darkness, Margaret reset her security systems and returned to her quarters, her mind processing this encounter with cold efficiency. She had revealed more than intended. Her response had been unmistakably that of a trained operative, not a frightened innkeeper. But the calculated risk had established boundaries and bought time. By morning, Blackwell would know with near certainty that Margaret Sullivan was indeed Margaret Reynolds. The question was what he would do with that confirmation. Attempt immediate extraction or pursue the conversation route his associate had suggested. Either way, the first real confrontation had occurred. Pieces were in motion that couldn't be recalled. Margaret's carefully constructed life in Pinewood Valley now balanced on a knife's edge, with forces gathering that threatened everything she had built over the past 3 years. As dawn approached, she completed her contingency preparations, then allowed herself 1 hour of tactical rest. Not true sleep, but the combat doze she had perfected during field operations, keeping her body still while portions of her mind remained vigilant for any threat. The coming day would bring decisions that couldn't be undone, Margaret Sullivan, with her trembling hands and quiet demeanour, might soon need to disappear forever. And in her place would stand Margaret Reynolds, steady-handed, precise and infinitely dangerous to those who threatened what she protected. The rain finally stopped as first light touched the mountains surrounding Pinewood Valley. A new day had begun, and with it, the next phase of a dangerous game where the stakes included not just Margaret's carefully constructed identity, but the safety of an entire community that had no idea what kind of storm was gathering in their peaceful valley. The morning arrived with crystal clarity, the rain having washed away both clouds and dust to leave Pinewood Valley gleaming in the early sunlight. Margaret moved through her kitchen with practiced efficiency, preparing breakfast for her remaining guests while her mind processed the implications of the previous night's confrontation. She had crossed a threshold by directly engaging with Vince, revealing capabilities that no ordinary innkeeper should possess. Blackwell would be analyzing that encounter, recalibrating his approach based on the near confirmation of her identity. The question was, what parameters governed his mission? Was he authorized to conduct extraction without definitive evidence? Was he under orders to avoid collateral damage? Most importantly, who had sent him, and how much did they already know about Margaret Reynolds' carefully constructed disappearance? She whisked eggs for omelettes. Her hands trembled visibly, partly the genuine symptom of her injury, partly deliberate performance for anyone watching. The tremor had become both a limitation and tactical asset, a reminder of what she had lost and a tool for what she might yet need to protect. The photographer, the only guest besides Blackwell, appeared first, his camera already hanging around his neck. "Morning, Mrs. Sullivan. Beautiful day after all that rain." "Indeed it is," Margaret replied with a warm smile. "Omelette? I've got mushrooms and peppers from the garden." "Sounds perfect. I'm heading up to Widow's Peak today for some landscape shots. Should have amazing visibility after the storm." Margaret placed coffee before him, the cup trembling slightly in her grasp. "Take extra water. That trail gets deceptively hot once the sun's fully up." "Will do." He glanced toward the stairs. "Your other guest is not down yet?" "Mr. Blackwell? Not yet?" Margaret kept her tone casual, though she had been monitoring Blackwell's room through subtle security measures. He had received a call at 5:47 a.m., spoken for exactly 3 minutes and 18 seconds, then begun packing certain items while leaving others in place, suggesting he was preparing for movement while maintaining his room as an operational base. After serving the photographer his breakfast, Margaret retreated to the kitchen under the pretext of preparing more coffee. Through the window, she observed 2 of Blackwell's men in the black SUV parked across the road, not attempting to conceal their presence now, but establishing visible surveillance. A power play designed to increase pressure. The back door opened, and Jenny Parker entered, the local teenager who helped with housekeeping 3 mornings a week. "Morning, Miss Sullivan. Sorry I'm a bit late. Dad's truck wouldn't start." Margaret made a swift decision. "Actually, Jenny, I'm giving you the day off. Paid, of course." She reached for her purse, extracting several bills. "In fact, why don't you take the rest of the week? I'm considering some renovations, and it might get a bit chaotic around here." Jenny's eyes widened at the unexpected windfall. "Are you sure? I don't mind working around construction or whatever." "I'm sure." Margaret pressed the money into the girl's hand, her own trembling noticeably. "Best to have fewer people underfoot. You go enjoy the break." After ushering Jenny out with further reassurances, Margaret returned to her breakfast preparations, mentally checking off one vulnerability addressed. The fewer civilians in the potential conflict zone, the better. Footsteps on the stairs announced Blackwell's arrival. He entered the dining room with the confident bearing of someone who believed they held the advantage, nodding to the photographer before taking a seat at his usual table by the fireplace. "Good morning, Mrs. Sullivan," he called, his voice carrying a new edge beneath its surface courtesy. "Coffee, if you wouldn't mind." Margaret brought the pot to his table, allowing the tremor in her hands to be prominently visible as she poured. "Sleep well, Mr. Blackwell?" "Like a baby," he replied, watching her hands with pointed interest. "Though I did hear some unusual noises in the night, perhaps a raccoon trying to get into the kitchen." The deliberate reference to Vince's intrusion hung between them, a test to gauge her reaction. Margaret allowed a flicker of confusion to cross her features. "Not that I heard, though the old pipes do make strange sounds sometimes, especially after heavy rain." Blackwell's smile was cold. "Indeed, it's amazing how ordinary things can seem threatening in the dark." Margaret met his gaze with carefully calibrated apprehension, not the defiance of a trained operative, but the nervous resolve of a civilian standing her ground. "Is there something specific you want to discuss, Mr. Blackwell? You seemed to have quite a few questions last night." "Just one question, actually." He leaned forward, lowering his voice, though the photographer sat well out of earshot. "Where can we speak privately?" Margaret considered her options. Controlling the location of their confrontation was crucial. "I have errands in town this morning. Perhaps we could meet at my cabin around 11. I assume you'd prefer a conversation without interruptions." Blackwell studied her face, likely assessing whether she was setting a trap. "The cabin would be perfect. 11 it is." After he had finished breakfast and departed the inn, Margaret moved with swift purpose. She had 3 hours to prepare not just the cabin, but herself. The time had come to reach out to a connection she had maintained, but never activated during her 3 years in Pinewood Valley. The one person who might provide crucial intelligence about Blackwell's mission parameters and authorization. In her private quarters, Margaret unlocked the hidden compartment containing her secure communications equipment. Using protocols established years ago, she composed an encrypted message to a specific dead drop address, one that would reach Daniel Harker, former CIA handler and the only person who had known about her planned disappearance after the Kandahar operation went wrong. Harker had been nearing retirement when Margaret died in that German hospital. He had tacitly supported her extraction, understanding that the agency's plans to sideline her to analysis would waste her field capabilities, even with the injury that had affected her shooting hand. He had helped erase certain records, planted false information in others, and created the documentary trail that allowed Margaret Sullivan to emerge with clean identification. If anyone knew whether Blackwell's mission was officially sanctioned or a rogue operation, it would be Harker. If anyone could provide insight into what parameters governed Blackwell's extraction authorization, it would be the man who had once written such parameters himself. The message was brief, containing only essential information. Her location. Compromised? Extraction team led by operative using Blackwell identity. Immediate guidance requested. She included details about Blackwell's tactics and resources that would help Harker identify which agency or contractor had deployed him. After sending the message through a cascade of security proxies, Margaret checked the time. 2 hours and 17 minutes until her meeting with Blackwell. She moved to her bedroom and opened the closet, pushing aside civilian clothes to reveal a hidden panel at the back. Inside lay items she had prepared but never expected to use. Clothing specifically selected for both tactical functionality and the appearance of ordinary civilian wear. She changed quickly into jeans reinforced with Kevlar panels, a loose-fitting blouse that concealed both the ceramic knife strapped to her forearm and a slim tactical harness, and hiking boots with modified soles that left no distinctive prints. A light jacket completed the ensemble, its multiple pockets containing essential supplies while appearing completely unremarkable. As she dressed, Margaret assessed her physical readiness with cold precision. The tremor in her hands was most pronounced in her right, her dominant side for shooting, the source of her extraction from field operations. With focus, she could control it for short periods, but sustained fine motor operations remained compromised. Her left hand, however, was steady. In the 3 years since her disappearance, she had methodically restrained herself for ambidextrous operation, adapting tactics and techniques to accommodate her limitations. She wasn't the shooter she had once been, the legendary steady-hand Reynolds, who could make impossible shots under impossible conditions. But she had become something perhaps more dangerous, an operative who had learned to transform weakness into tactical advantage. Margaret swept her hair back into a simple ponytail, applied minimal makeup consistent with her cover identity, and checked her secure communications one final time. No response from Harker yet, but that wasn't unexpected. The protocols they had established prioritized security over speed. Before leaving her quarters, Margaret activated additional security measures throughout the inn. Subtle systems that would alert her to any intrusion or tampering during her absence. Then, maintaining the appearance of an innkeeper preparing for a routine outing, she informed the photographer she would be running errands in town and departed through the main entrance, her movements unhurried, her demeanor relaxed, despite the weight of concealed equipment. The drive into Pinewood took exactly 7 minutes, each bend in the road familiar after 3 years of daily transit. Margaret parked her sedan in front of Clara's diner, establishing a visible presence in town before her meeting with Blackwell. Inside, the morning crowd greeted her with the casual familiarity of small-town life, unaware of the currents moving beneath the surface of their community. "Morning, Maggie," Clara called from behind the counter. "Coffee, please." Margaret took a seat at the counter, positioning herself to observe both the street outside and the diner's interior. Her hands trembled visibly as she accepted the mug Clara placed before her. Clara frowned, noting the tremor. "Bad day for the hands, huh?" "Just tired," Margaret replied with a weary smile. "Didn't sleep well with all that rain." The diner's door opened, admitting Sheriff Banks, who nodded to various patrons before taking the stool beside Margaret. "Morning, Maggie. Clara?" His expression carried the weight of new concerns. "Everything quiet at the inn last night?" Margaret allowed mild confusion to cross her features. "Of course. Why wouldn't it be?" Banks signaled Clara for coffee before answering. "Deputy Wilson noticed some unusual activity during his patrol. Thought he saw someone moving around your property around 2 in the morning, near the kitchen door." Margaret feigned surprise, then consideration. Could have been a deer. They sometimes come right up to the garden, especially after rain brings up all the worms. The sheriff didn't appear convinced, but nodded anyway. "Maybe so. Still, I'd feel better if you stayed in town for a few days. Blackwell and his friends have been asking questions all over the valley. Something doesn't sit right about them." This suggestion complicated Margaret's carefully constructed timeline. She shook her head, offering a smile tinged with the stubborn independence that characterized her cover identity. "I appreciate the concern, Tom, but the inn is my home. I can't just abandon it because of some nosy visitors." "Then let me assign a deputy." "That's really not necessary," Margaret interrupted gently. "I'm sure they'll move on soon once they realize there's nothing of interest here." Banks studied her face, his decades of law enforcement experience clearly registering something beneath her composed exterior. "Maggie, is there something you're not telling me? Because if you're in some kind of trouble—" "No trouble," she assured him, patting his arm with a trembling hand. "Just the usual challenges of running an inn. Speaking of which, I should get to the general store before they sell out of Ed's fresh bread." As she stood to leave, Banks caught her wrist, gently but with purpose. "Whatever's going on, Maggie, you don't have to handle it alone. That's what community means." The sincerity in his words caught Margaret off guard, triggering an unexpected, emotional response that had no place in operational planning. For a moment, Margaret Sullivan and Margaret Reynolds existed simultaneously. The widow who had found unexpected belonging in this small town, and the operative who had spent a lifetime maintaining distance from emotional attachments. "I know, Tom," she said finally, her voice soft, "and I'm grateful, but trust me when I say I can handle Mr. Blackwell." She left the diner with Banks watching after her, concern evident in his weathered face. The brief exchange had reinforced a complication Margaret had never anticipated when establishing her cover in Pinewood Valley, genuine connections to people who cared about her welfare, who might put themselves at risk if the situation escalated. At the general store, Margaret purchased items consistent with her cover identity's routine: bread, coffee, a newspaper, while conducting counter-surveillance through the store's large front windows. Blackwell's men maintained their visible presence, the black SUV now parked across from the general store, its occupants watching her movements with professional attention. The surveillance was deliberately obvious, another pressure tactic designed to unsettle the target. Margaret allowed appropriate unease to show in her body language as she completed her purchases and returned to her car, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the keys. As she drove toward her cabin for the meeting with Blackwell, Margaret's secure phone vibrated with an incoming message. She pulled onto a Forest Service turnout, checked for surveillance, then retrieved the device. Harker's response was brief but revelatory. "Blackwell, Atlas Contractor, Clearwater Authorization. Proceed with extreme caution, kill order possible." The cold weight of this information settled in Margaret's stomach. Atlas was a private military contractor, known for handling operations too sensitive or politically problematic for official agencies. Clearwater Authorization meant Blackwell had wide operational latitude, including lethal force if the target resisted extraction. Most concerning was the reference to a possible kill order. If Blackwell couldn't extract Margaret Reynolds alive, he might be authorized to ensure she didn't remain in place, a standard protocol for compromised assets with access to sensitive information. Margaret deleted the message, then powered down the secure device. The parameters had been clarified, and none of them favored a peaceful resolution. Blackwell wasn't just trying to locate and identify Margaret Reynolds. He was tasked with removing her from Pinewood Valley one way or another, which meant the meeting at the cabin was not merely a conversation. It was potentially a final confrontation. Margaret continued driving, her mind recalibrating strategy based on this new intelligence. If Blackwell operated under Clearwater parameters, negotiation options were limited. He would have specific objectives and timeline with contingency authorizations if primary objectives couldn't be met. The cabin came into view, its weathered exterior peaceful in the late morning sunlight. Margaret parked her car in the small clearing and performed a visual sweep of the perimeter, noting signs that someone had already arrived. Subtle disturbances in the underbrush, a recently broken spiderweb on the porch railing. Blackwell had come early, establishing position before her arrival. Standard procedure for controlling a potentially hostile meeting. Margaret gathered her shopping bags from the passenger seat, maintaining her cover as she approached the cabin. Her right hand trembled visibly, but her left concealed within. A shopping bag that also contained the ceramic knife she had transferred from her arm sheath was perfectly steady. She paused at the cabin door, sensing rather than seeing the presence inside. 3 years of civilian cover hadn't dulled the instincts honed through decades of operational experience. Margaret Reynolds was fully awake now, analyzing entry angles, defensive positions, and response options with cold precision. The doors. "Open, Mrs. Sullivan," Blackwell's voice called from within. "Or would you prefer I call you by another name?" Margaret stepped inside, blinking as her eyes adjusted to the dimmer interior. Blackwell sat in one of the wooden chairs near the cold fireplace, his posture relaxed, but his awareness fully engaged. He was alone, visibly at least. Though Margaret suspected Vince or another team member maintained an overwatch position outside. "Mrs. Sullivan is fine," she replied, setting her bags on the small kitchen counter. Her hands trembled as she unpacked bread and coffee. The perfect picture of a nervous civilian trying to maintain normal routines despite extraordinary circumstances. Blackwell watched this performance with something approaching admiration. "You know, in 20 years of field operations, I've never seen a cover maintained so meticulously. The tremor is particularly effective. Physical limitation as concealment for exceptional capability. Brilliant adaptation." Margaret turned to face him, allowing Margaret Sullivan's demeanor to remain primary, while Margaret Reynolds assessed the tactical situation from behind that carefully constructed facade. "I think it's time you told me exactly what you want, Mr. Blackwell. No more photographs or vague accusations. Just the truth." Blackwell nodded, acknowledging the reasonable request. "The truth, then. I've been sent to bring in Margaret Reynolds, former CIA Special Activities operator who disappeared 3 years ago rather than accept reassignment after an injury compromised her shooting hand." He gestured toward her trembling right hand. "The same injury you've transformed into the centerpiece of your cover identity." "And if I told you I'm not this Margaret Reynolds?" she asked, her voice steady despite the visible tremor in her hands. "I'd say the evidence suggests otherwise. Your reaction to Vince's intrusion last night was particularly telling, not the response of a frightened innkeeper, but the precise counteraction of a trained operative." Margaret didn't acknowledge or deny this assessment. "Who sent you?" "People concerned about loose ends," Blackwell replied, his tone professional rather than threatening. "People who believe Margaret Reynolds possesses information that could complicate certain ongoing operations." "Atlas," Margaret said, watching his reaction closely, "operating under Clearwater authorization." Blackwell's expression betrayed nothing, but a subtle shift in his posture confirmed her intelligence. "The specifics aren't important. What matters is that I have a job to do, and limited time to accomplish it without complications." The implied threat hung in the air between them. Margaret moved to the window, ostensibly looking out at the peaceful forest, but actually assessing exit routes and defensive positions. Her hands trembled against the windowsill, maintaining the performance even as her mind calculated probabilities and options with cold precision. "What exactly does this job entail?" she asked finally. "Taking me where? To whom?" "I'm not at liberty to share operational details," Blackwell answered, "professional courtesy tempering operational security. But I can assure you that no one wants this to become messy. A clean extraction, a debriefing, and then potential options for your future that don't involve hiding in mountain towns." Margaret turned back to face him, allowing Margaret Sullivan's vulnerability to show through in her expression. "And if I refuse?" Blackwell's eyes hardened slightly. "Then protocols dictate escalating measures to ensure the security of the information you possess. Measures that could impact not just you, but this community you've integrated yourself into." There it was, the confirmation of what Harker's message had implied. Blackwell operated under protocols that authorized collateral damage if necessary to complete his primary objective. Pinewood Valley and its residents were now potential leverage in his extraction strategy. Margaret's hands stilled momentarily as anger flashed through her, then resumed their trembling as she regained control. "You would threaten innocent people. I would complete my mission," Blackwell corrected, his tone remaining professional. "How complicated that becomes depends entirely on your cooperation." The lines were drawn now, the parameters clear. Margaret Reynolds, who had spent a lifetime making impossible choices in impossible situations, faced perhaps her most difficult decision yet. She could surrender to Blackwell's extraction, protecting Pinewood Valley but abandoning the life she had built. Or she could resist, triggering protocols that might endanger the very community she had come to think of as home. What Blackwell couldn't know was that during her 3 years in Pinewood Valley, Margaret had prepared for this exact scenario, establishing contingencies, resources, and defensive measures that went far beyond what any standard extraction team would anticipate. "I need time to consider my options," she said finally, her voice that of Margaret Sullivan, while her mind operated with Margaret Reynolds' tactical precision. "You have until tomorrow morning," Blackwell replied, standing to indicate the meeting was concluding. "After that, my operational parameters shift. For everyone's benefit, I hope you make the practical choice." As he moved toward the door, Margaret remained by the window, her trembling hands clasped before her in a posture that suggested resignation rather than resistance. But behind that carefully maintained facade, decisions had already been made, strategies already formulated. Blackwell had brought the fight to her doorstep, threatening not just her carefully constructed identity, but the community that had unwittingly sheltered her. Now he would discover what happened when a predator cornered someone they believed to be prey, only to find they had trapped something far more dangerous than anticipated. "One last thing, Mr. Blackwell," Margaret called as he reached the door. "If you or your men come near my inn again uninvited, you'll learn why they used to call me Steady Hand." Blackwell paused, turning back with newfound respect in his expression. "Even with your injury." Margaret allowed a cold smile that belonged entirely to Margaret Reynolds, not the widow Sullivan. "Especially with my injury, it taught me that limitations are just opportunities for adaptation." As Blackwell departed, Margaret returned to the kitchen counter, her hands resuming their characteristic tremor as she methodically put away the groceries she had brought. To anyone watching, she appeared to be processing a difficult conversation, perhaps considering surrender to inevitable circumstances. In reality, she was already mapping the battlefield, calculating resource allocation, and formulating the strategy that would protect both her identity and Pinewood Valley from the threat Blackwell represented. The trembling widow was preparing for war, and her enemies were about to discover that those shaking hands became remarkably steady when wrapped around a weapon. The sun hung low over Pinewood Valley, painting the western sky in vivid oranges and purples as darkness prepared to claim the mountains. Margaret stood on the inn's back porch, her cardigan pulled tight against the evening chill, watching as shadows lengthened across her carefully tended garden. To any observer, she appeared to be a solitary figure enjoying the sunset, a widow finding simple pleasure in nature's beauty. In reality, she was conducting final environmental assessment, cataloging changes in visibility and ambient noise, levels that would affect the coming operation. Her right hand trembled as it clutched her coffee mug, but her mind was crystalline in its clarity, processing tactical variables with machine-like precision. Blackwell's ultimatum had left no room for compromise. By morning, Margaret Reynolds would surrender for extraction, or protocols would escalate, potentially endangering Pinewood Valley itself. It was a scenario she had anticipated, but hoped to avoid when establishing her cover identity 3 years ago. Now, facing the inevitable, she had made her decision. Margaret Reynolds would not be extracted, and Margaret Sullivan would not abandon the home and community she had built, which left only one viable option: neutralizing the threat Blackwell and his team posed, decisively enough to send a message to whoever had dispatched them. The hours since their meeting at the cabin had been filled with methodical preparation. Margaret had confirmed that all guests had checked out, leaving the inn empty except for herself and Blackwell, who had maintained his room as an operational base while conducting surveillance from multiple positions around the property. His team, which she had now identified as consisting of 5 operatives, including Blackwell himself, had established a perimeter that effectively isolated Sullivan's Rest from immediate assistance. Sheriff Banks had called twice, his concern evident even through the careful casualness of his tone. Margaret had reassured him, suggesting that Blackwell would be departing soon and everything was returning to normal. She had deliberately steered him away from sending deputies past the inn that night, removing potential civilian casualties from the equation. Now, as twilight deepened toward true night, Margaret returned inside and moved through her inn with the measured pace of her normal evening routine. She locked doors, closed curtains, and turned off main lights, all while subtly activating the defensive measures she had integrated into the building's structure over the past 3 years. Pressure sensors beneath the gravel drive would alert her to vehicles approaching. Modified motion detectors covered blind spots that standard security systems often missed. Reinforced panels in strategic walls would provide cover during potential exchanges of fire. Every aspect of Sullivan's Rest had been designed with dual purpose: comfort for guests and tactical advantage for its owner if her past ever caught up with her. In her private quarters, Margaret changed into clothing, selected for both functionality and symbolic purpose. Black tactical pants with reinforced knees, a dark grey Henley that allowed freedom of movement while concealing the knife strapped to her forearm, and the sturdy boots she wore for trail maintenance. Over these, incongruously, she placed her usual apron, a visual marker of Margaret Sullivan that would confirm identity at a distance. 3 weapons were positioned within easy reach throughout the inn's main floor: a compact tactical shotgun, secured beneath the reception desk, a 9mm handgun hidden in a modified flour canister in the kitchen, and a combat knife magnetically attached beneath the dining room sideboard. Additional equipment waited in predetermined locations, each selected to cover potential engagement scenarios. As full darkness descended, Margaret performed one final check of her security system, confirming that Blackwell's team had maintained their positions: 2 operatives in the black SUV at the main entrance, Vince monitoring the forest perimeter behind the property, the nervous one called Rabbit positioned near the road junction with communications equipment, and Blackwell himself now moving toward the inn from the cabin direction. The game was entering its final phase. Margaret poured herself a cup of tea, allowing her hands their characteristic tremor as she settled into a rocking chair in the darkened front room, positioned to observe the approach while remaining difficult to see from outside. The teacup rattled slightly against its saucer, the perfect image of a nervous widow awaiting an unwelcome visitor. At precisely 9:17 p.m., Blackwell approached the front door. He didn't knock immediately, instead conducting a careful assessment of the building's exterior, noting the darkened windows and apparent emptiness. When he finally rapped his knuckles against the wooden frame, the sound carried a deliberate rhythm. 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more. Margaret rose slowly, moving to answer with the careful pace of an older woman rather than the combat-ready operative coiled beneath that facade. Her right hand trembled visibly as she unlocked the door, while her left remained steady, positioned near the concealed knife. "Mr. Blackwell," she greeted him, her voice carrying just the right note of resignation. "I expected you in the morning." "Change of plans," he replied, his expression professional rather than threatening. "My employers are eager to conclude our business. May I come in?" Margaret stepped aside, allowing him to enter the darkened foyer. She didn't activate the main lights, leaving the space illuminated only by a single lamp on the reception desk, creating shadows that would conceal her movements while limiting his visual assessment. "Tea," she offered, maintaining her cover identity's hospitality even as Margaret Reynolds calculated angles and distances with lethal precision. "No, thank you." Blackwell remained standing, his posture relaxed but ready. "Have you reached a decision about our discussion?" Margaret moved toward the reception desk, positioning herself near the concealed shotgun. "I have questions first. What happens to Margaret Sullivan if Margaret Reynolds agrees to go with you? Does this identity simply disappear?" "That would be the cleanest approach," Blackwell acknowledged, "though certain arrangements could be made to transition ownership of this property to maintain appearances. And what guarantee do I have that Pinewood Valley remains undisturbed if I cooperate?" Blackwell spread his hands in a gesture of reasonable negotiation. "My team has no interest in this town beyond our primary objective. Once that's achieved, we'll withdraw completely." Margaret nodded slowly, as if considering this assurance. In reality, she was monitoring subtle changes in the security system display, visible only from her angle behind the desk. Movement patterns indicating Blackwell's team was adjusting. Positions, likely preparing for extraction. "One last question," she said, her trembling right hand reaching for her teacup while her left moved closer to the desk drawer. "Who specifically authorized this operation? Atlas doesn't move without high-level approval." A flicker of surprise crossed Blackwell's features, confirmation that her intelligence was accurate. "That's not relevant to your decision." "It's entirely relevant," Margaret countered, her voice shifting subtly from Margaret Sullivan's gentle tones to the harder edge of Margaret Reynolds. "Because whoever sent you didn't provide complete information about what happened after Kandahar." Blackwell's posture changed almost imperceptibly, the shift from negotiation to heightened alert. "Enlighten me." "The nerve damage wasn't the only reason I disappeared," Margaret said, her right hand now perfectly still on the countertop. A tell that Blackwell immediately registered, his own hand moving slightly toward his concealed weapon. "There were files I discovered during that operation, files implicating certain officials in operations that were never authorized by oversight committees. This was calculated misinformation, creating doubt about his mission parameters while suggesting her extraction might be motivated by covering up internal corruption rather than legitimate security concerns." Blackwell's expression remained impassive, but a new calculation was visible in his eyes. "That's an interesting theory. Does it change your decision about coming with us?" "It changes everything," Margaret replied, her voice now fully that of the operative rather than the widow. "Because it means this isn't about national security, it's about certain individuals covering their tracks." Outside, a vehicle engine started, the black SUV pulling closer to the inn's entrance, preparation for rapid extraction. Through the window, Margaret could see its headlights illuminating the gravel drive. "Your theory doesn't alter the operational reality," Blackwell said, his tone hardening. "You're coming with us tonight, Reynolds. Voluntarily would be preferable, but my authorization covers alternative approaches." Margaret allowed a cold smile that belonged entirely to her operative persona. "Did your authorization mention that this building has been prepared for exactly this scenario for 3 years, that every entrance is monitored, every approach covered?" Blackwell's hand moved decisively toward his weapon now, professionalism giving way to tactical necessity. "Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. That's exactly what I was going to say to you." Margaret's trembling right hand suddenly steadied as she pressed a hidden button beneath the reception desk. Throughout the inn, predetermined systems activated simultaneously. Metal shutters slammed down over windows. Security doors sealed external. Entrances and lights cut out completely, plunging the interior into absolute darkness. In that darkness, Margaret moved with the assured precision of someone who had memorized every inch of the space. 3 steps left, duck beneath the countertop, retrieve the shotgun secured there. Blackwell fired twice toward her last position, the muzzle flash momentarily illuminating the room before darkness reclaimed it. "Impressive preparation, Blackwell," called, his voice calm despite the escalation. "But ultimately futile. My team has the building surrounded. This only delays the inevitable." Margaret didn't respond, instead moving silently toward the dining room, where secondary systems would provide her with tactical advantage. She activated her communications jammer, another preparation made years ago, cutting off Blackwell's contact with his external team. In the dining room, night vision panels embedded in the ceiling activated, bathing the space in infrared illumination, invisible to the naked eye, but clear through the specialized contacts Margaret had inserted earlier. While Blackwell remained, effectively blind, she could see with perfect clarity. "Your team can't help you," she called, her voice echoing slightly to mask her position. "Not with the jamming field active, and they can't enter without breaching reinforced access points. We're effectively alone here, Blackwell." She heard him moving cautiously through the darkness, his training evident in how quietly he navigated, despite the unfamiliar terrain. "Then it's just you and me. And with all due respect to your legendary status, Reynolds, your shooting hand isn't what it used to be." Margaret smiled in the darkness, positioning herself behind the heavy oak table that provided both cover and a stable shooting platform. "That's the interesting thing about limitations, Blackwell. They force adaptation." When he emerged into the dining room, Margaret could see him clearly through her specialized contacts, moving with tactical discipline, weapons oriented toward likely hiding positions. But he was operating blind, relying on training and instinct rather than visual confirmation. "For instance," she continued, deliberately creating sound to draw his attention while simultaneously moving to a different position. "I spent 3 years retraining myself for left-handed shooting. Not as good as I once was with my right, perhaps, but more than adequate at room distance." Blackwell fired toward her voice, the rounds splintering the wooden sideboard where she had been moments before. Margaret responded with a single shot from her position across the room, non-lethal, targeted precisely at his shooting arm. He grunted in pain, but didn't drop his weapon, instead diving for cover behind the stone fireplace hearth. "You could have taken a kill shot," he observed, surprise evident in his voice despite his professional control. "I don't want you dead, Blackwell," Margaret replied, circling to maintain positional advantage. "I want you to deliver a message." Outside, she could hear his team attempting to breach the building, futile efforts against security measures designed to withstand much more substantial assaults. The inn had been Margaret's final fallback position, constructed to provide a defensive advantage against precisely this type of extraction operation. "What message?" Blackwell asked, applying pressure to his wounded arm while maintaining awareness of potential attack angles. "That Margaret Reynolds died 3 years ago. Margaret Sullivan is simply a widow who runs an inn in a mountain town, and that anyone who threatens either her or Pinewood Valley will regret it deeply." Blackwell laughed softly, the sound edged with grudging respect. "You expect Atlas to simply abandon an authorized operation because their first team failed?" "No," Margaret acknowledged, her voice hardening. "I expect them to reassess when they review the evidence I've compiled over the past 3 years, documentation of exactly which operations were concealed from oversight, which officials exceeded authorization, and where the bodies are buried. Literally in some cases. This was her true insurance policy, not just the defensive preparations at Sullivan's Rest, but the dead man's switch she had established that would release classified information if she disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances. Information damaging enough to specific powerful individuals that they would prefer to maintain the fiction that Margaret Reynolds had died rather than risk exposure. "You're bluffing," Blackwell said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Check. Your secure communication when you're outside jamming range," Margaret replied. "Your employers will have received the preliminary file by now, just enough to demonstrate the extent of what I possess, without revealing everything. Their risk assessment will have changed considerably." A heavy impact shook the front door, Blackwell's team attempting forced entry. The reinforced frame held easily, designed to withstand far more substantial assaults. "We appear to be at an impasse," Blackwell observed, professional enough to recognize when tactical advantage had shifted. "Not really," Margaret countered, "because in approximately 30 seconds, local law enforcement will arrive, responding to an anonymous call about armed intruders at Sullivan's Rest. Your team can either be caught in a compromising position that would expose your operation, or they can withdraw temporarily." On cue, distant sirens became audible, growing steadily louder as they approached up the valley road. "This isn't over," Blackwell warned, though she could hear him moving toward the kitchen, seeking the rear exit she had deliberately left accessible, an evacuation route that would allow him to withdraw without further engagement. "It is over," Margaret corrected him, maintaining her position without pursuing. "Because by morning, your employers will have reassessed their options and determined that leaving Margaret Sullivan in peace serves their interests better than creating a situation that might expose certain historical operations." The sirens grew louder as Sheriff Banks and his deputies approached. Through her security system, Margaret observed Blackwell's team rapidly withdrawing into the forest, their disciplined retreat indicating professional recognition of a compromised operation. "You've won this round," Blackwell acknowledged as he prepared to exit through the kitchen door. "But don't make the mistake of thinking they'll simply forget about you." "They don't need to forget," Margaret replied, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "They just need to understand that the cost of pursuing me exceeds any potential benefit. It's a simple risk assessment, their specialty, as I recall." She activated the emergency lighting system, bathing the kitchen in soft illumination as Blackwell prepared to depart. His arm still bled from her precisely placed shot, but the wound was minor, enough to demonstrate her capability without creating a permanent injury. "One last thing," she said, her trembling right hand now perfectly steady as she lowered her weapon. "If you or anyone else ever threatens Pinewood Valley again, what gets released won't be just evidence of past misconduct. It will be everything. Names, dates, operations, all of it. This town is under my protection now." Blackwell studied her face, professional assessment giving way to genuine respect. "You know, the stories about you never mentioned this level of tactical planning. They focused on your shooting skills, not your strategic thinking. People often fixate on the most visible capability," Margaret observed with a cold smile. "It creates blind spots they don't recognize until it's too late." As police vehicles pulled into the inn's driveway, lights flashing through the windows, Blackwell slipped through the kitchen door and disappeared into the darkness. Margaret quickly secured her weapon in its hidden compartment, then deliberately missed her hair and clothes to appear as if she'd been through a frightening ordeal. By the time Sheriff Banks burst through the front door, weapon drawn and expression fierce with protective determination, Margaret Sullivan had fully replaced Margaret Reynolds once more, her hands trembling visibly, her posture conveying the shock of a civilian after a traumatic experience. "Maggie, thank God!" Banks exclaimed, holstering his weapon as he rushed to her side. "Are you hurt? Dispatch got a call about armed men at the inn." "They're gone," Margaret said, allowing her voice to shake appropriately. "They broke in, said they were looking for something. I hid in the storage closet. I heard shots, but—" She gestured vaguely at the damage to her dining room. "I think they argued among themselves and left when they heard the sirens." Banks's expression darkened with anger as he surveyed the destruction. "Blackwell's crew had to be. I knew they were trouble the moment they rolled into town." He gently guided Margaret to a chair. "Don't worry, Maggie, we'll find them. I just want them gone," she said softly, her trembling hands clutching the chair arms. "I want my quiet life back." As the sheriff organized his deputies to search the surrounding area, a search Margaret knew would yield nothing, she maintained her cover identity with the perfect balance of distress and resilience that characterized Margaret Sullivan in the town's eyes. By morning, confirmation arrived through channels only Margaret Reynolds would recognize. Operational parameters adjusted, extraction cancelled, surveillance discontinued. A professional courtesy acknowledging that the risk assessment had, indeed, changed, just as she had predicted. Blackwell and his team departed Pinewood Valley before dawn, their black SUV and pickup truck passing quietly through town without stopping. Sheriff Banks would later report they had crossed the state line by noon, moving with the purposeful haste of men who knew when a mission had become untenable. In the days that followed, Margaret Sullivan accepted the town's support with appropriate gratitude as she repaired the damage to her inn. Casseroles appeared on her doorstep, local men volunteered to fix her broken windows and splintered door frames, and Sheriff Banks increased patrols past Sullivan's Rest until assured the threat had truly departed. No one in Pinewood Valley ever connected the trembling widow with the precision shooting that had wounded Blackwell, a detail he hadn't shared with local authorities during their brief investigation. No one suspected that the damage to the inn had been carefully controlled, designed to support her cover story while concealing the true nature of the confrontation. 2 weeks after Blackwell's departure, Margaret stood on her back porch watching sunset paint Silver Peak in golden light. Her right hand trembled as she held her evening tea, the familiar movement now layered with new meaning, both genuine symptom and deliberate disguise, limitation and tactical advantage combined. Sheriff Banks joined her, leaning against the porch railing with the comfortable ease of a trusted friend. "Quiet night," he observed. "Think it'll stay that way." Margaret smiled, the expression containing elements of both her identities. The gentle warmth of Margaret Sullivan blended with the knowing confidence of Margaret Reynolds. "I believe it will," she said softly. "Some storms pass through once, and don't return. You seem different since it happened," Banks noted, his perceptive gaze studying her face. "More settled somehow." Margaret considered this assessment, recognizing the truth in it. The confrontation with Blackwell had resolved something within her, the lingering fear that her past would eventually destroy what she had built in Pinewood Valley. Now, having faced that threat and neutralized it, she had achieved an integration of her dual identities that hadn't seemed possible before. "I suppose facing your fears can change a person," she replied, her trembling hand setting down the teacup with deliberate care. "Makes you appreciate what you have, what you're willing to protect." Banks nodded, understanding at least the surface meaning of her words. "Well, whatever those bastards were after, I'm glad they didn't get it. And I'm glad you're still here, Maggie. Pinewood wouldn't be the same without you." As darkness settled over the valley and lights began to appear in distant windows, Margaret Reynolds, who was now also fully Margaret Sullivan, looked out over the community that had become her home. Her hands might tremble when serving, and coffee or baking bread, but they had proven steady enough when it mattered most. The widow with shaking hands had defended her home with the deadly precision of her former life, creating a perfect synthesis of who she had been and who she had become. And anyone who mistook those trembling hands for weakness in the future would learn the same costly lesson as the Blackwell team. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones hiding in plain sight, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal their true nature. In Pinewood Valley, that predator kept watch from a modest inn at the edge of town, serving homemade pie with trembling hands, while her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the horizon for any threat to the peace she had fought so hard to secure. Up. Next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.